What if the most powerful men in American history were also its most carefully guarded secrets? We're talking about presidents who led wars while hiding debilitating illnesses. Men who stood at podiums, shook hands, made decisions that shaped the entire world, all while their doctors quietly panicked behind closed doors. Some of them could barely walk, some couldn't see. Some were on medications that would make your head spin. And almost none of it was ever reported, because the press looked the other way. The doctors signed confidentiality agreements, and the government decided you didn't need to know. But here's the thing, the truth has a way of crawling out eventually. Through declassified records, deathbed confessions, private diaries, and medical files that were never supposed to go public. And what those files reveal is genuinely shocking. So before we get into it, do me a favor, hit subscribe and give this video a like, because this kind of history doesn't exactly get pushed by the algorithm, and I need your help making sure these stories actually reach people. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, and settle in, because we're about to go through 100 secrets about the secret illnesses of the US presidents. Things that were hidden from the public, buried by their administrations, and in some cases actively lied about while history was being made. These aren't rumors. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented medical realities that were kept from the American people, while those same people were being asked to trust these men with their lives, their wars, their futures. Some of what you're about to hear will make you sad. Some of it will make you angry, and some of it will make you wonder how any of it was ever kept quiet for as long as it was. Let's start at the beginning, with a president whose health problems were so severe, so obvious, and so carefully concealed that the entire country essentially operated a medical cover-up without even knowing it was participating. Number one, George Washington's denture pain. Everyone knows Washington had dentures. What they don't tell you is how much those dentures destroyed his daily life. His famous sets weren't made of wood. That's a myth. They were made of ivory, animal teeth, and in some cases human teeth pulled from the mouths of enslaved people. And they fit terribly. They pressed against his gums, caused constant bleeding, and left him in chronic pain that never fully went away. The dentures pushed his lips outward, which is why he looked so stiff and uncomfortable in every portrait. Because he was. He couldn't eat normally. He struggled to speak clearly in public. He turned down social engagements because chewing was agony. The man commanding the Continental Army, and later running the entire United States government, was doing it through a fog of constant mouth pain. He wrote about it in letters, complained to his dentist repeatedly, and never found a solution that worked. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a chronic condition that shaped how Washington presented himself to the world, how he communicated, and how history literally perceived his face. Number two, George Washington's carbuncle surgery. In 1789, while the new American government was still finding its footing, George Washington developed a massive infected carbuncle on his left thigh. We're talking about a deep, agonizing abscess the size of a fist that had to be surgically removed without anesthesia, because anesthesia didn't exist. The surgery took place while Washington was effectively bedridden for weeks. He couldn't sit on a horse. He had to ride in a specially modified carriage lying on his side just to travel. His recovery was slow and genuinely uncertain. There were real concerns that he might not survive it. The infection had spread, and surgeons of the era had limited tools and zero germ theory. Washington pushed through it, returned to duties, and said relatively little publicly about how close the situation had come to catastrophe. But this was the president of the brand new United States, the man the entire fragile experiment depended on, lying in bed recovering from emergency surgery, while the government nervously waited to find out whether he was going to make it. Number three, George Washington's fatal throat infection. On December 14, 1799, George Washington died at Mount Vernon after a rapid and brutal illness that likely began as epiglottitis, a severe swelling of the tissue at the base of the throat. He woke up struggling to breathe and swallow. His doctors were called, and here's where the story gets genuinely horrifying. In the span of roughly 12 hours, his physicians removed somewhere between 5 and 9 pints of his blood through repeated bloodletting. To put that in perspective, the human body contains about 10 pints total. They essentially drained him. The medical thinking of the time held that bloodletting would relieve inflammation. Instead, it sent Washington into shock and accelerated his death. Modern medical analysis strongly suggests that a man with his condition, given proper treatment, would likely have survived. Instead, the first president of the United States was killed at least in part by his own doctors, following accepted medical practice, while trying to save him. Number 4. John Adams and smallpox inoculation. John Adams had a deeply personal relationship with smallpox. He watched it tear through communities, decimate military ranks, and kill people he cared about. So in 1764, years before becoming president, Adams made the decision to inoculate himself, which at the time was a genuinely dangerous and controversial choice. Inoculation then meant deliberately introducing live smallpox material into your body and hoping your immune response was stronger than the disease. Adams spent weeks in quarantine, seriously ill, uncertain whether the procedure would save him or kill him. It saved him. And that experience shaped his later support for public health measures in ways that don't always get recognized. He saw firsthand what preventable disease could do to a fighting force and a population. His willingness to undergo a risky, stigmatized medical procedure before it was politically popular is one of the less glamorous but genuinely significant things about him. Number 5. Thomas Jefferson's chronic migraines. Thomas Jefferson suffered from severe, recurring migraines for most of his adult life. Not just headaches, migraines that lasted for days at a time, that forced him into darkened rooms, away from reading, away from writing, away from the diplomatic correspondence that was essentially his entire job description. He documented them in his letters and journals. Some episodes left him functionally incapacitated for a week or more. During critical periods of his presidency, during negotiations, during legislative debates, during moments when the country genuinely needed his attention, Jefferson was sometimes lying still in a dark room waiting for the pain to pass. He tried various remedies, none of them particularly effective by modern standards. The migraines reportedly improved somewhat in his later years, but they were a constant thread of suffering running through a life that history remembers mostly as one of ideas and eloquence. Number 6. Thomas Jefferson's digestive troubles. Jefferson complained throughout his life about stomach problems, cramping, irregular digestion, discomfort that he connected to stress, travel, and the generally unpredictable rhythms of life in public office. He was particular about his diet, preferring vegetables and lighter foods in ways that were unusual for his era, and his digestive sensitivity was part of the reason. Modern historians and physicians looking at his correspondence have noted patterns consistent with what we might today describe as a stress-related gastrointestinal condition. During especially turbulent periods of his presidency, the complaints increased. And when you consider the weight of what Jefferson was managing, the Louisiana Purchase, political attacks, the contradictions of his own life, perhaps the more surprising thing is that his stomach held up as long as it did. Number 7. James Madison's frail health. James Madison was 5'4", painfully thin and sick so often that some contemporaries wondered how he was even alive, let alone running a country. From his youth he complained of bilious attacks, sudden waves of weakness, stomach distress, and crushing fatigue that left him barely able to function. Friends described him as delicate and feeble, worried that any strong exertion might simply break him. In an era that equated leadership with broad shoulders and battlefield heroics, Madison's body looked like it had missed the memo. Yet this physically fragile man became the architect of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He fought most of his political battles, not with sabers or speeches that shook the rafters, but with carefully constructed arguments drafted while his body was betraying him. When people questioned his stamina during the War of 1812, they weren't entirely wrong to worry. His health really was that precarious. The quiet irony is that one of the most powerful political systems in the world was designed by a man who regularly had to lie down. Number 8. James Madison's mysterious seizure-like episodes. Long before James Madison became president, people who knew him in his 20s told stories about strange spells that came over him. He would suddenly turn pale, grow unsteady, and seem to lose contact with the world around him, as if his mind had briefly stepped out of the room. One friend wrote that Madison was occasionally lost in fits of sudden derangement of the head, language vague enough that modern historians argue about what it really means. Some see in those descriptions the outlines of seizure activity, perhaps a form of epilepsy, happening in a time when there were no words for it that didn't sound like madness or possession. Others think it may have been extreme migraines, panic episodes, or some combination of both. Madison himself seemed deeply anxious about these attacks, worrying they made him unfit for marriage, for public life, for the strain of politics. Whatever they were, they haunted his sense of self. They were never publicly discussed while he was president, but the man calmly defending constitutional principles in debate may have remembered very private moments when his own brain betrayed him without warning. Number 9. James Monroe's war wounds, before he was the calm, almost sleepy figure associated with the era of good feelings. James Monroe was a 19-year-old officer charging into British fire at the Battle of Trenton. During that famous Christmas attack in 1776, Monroe was hit by a musket ball that tore into his shoulder and sliced through blood vessels, leaving him bleeding out in the snow. A surgeon clamped the artery and saved his life, but the bullet and the damage it caused never really left him. For the rest of his days, Monroe carried the consequences of that wound: stiffness, pain, reduced range of motion, and the constant reminder of how close he had come to dying before the United States even existed on paper. When he later walked into cabinet meetings or diplomatic receptions looking composed, he was doing it with scar tissue tugging at every movement. The revolution didn't just give him a resume line. It left him with a chronic injury he dragged through decades of public service. Number 10. James Monroe's chronic malaria. Monroe's military and diplomatic work took him through humid battlefields and swampy, mosquito-ridden regions at a time when no one knew what malaria was, only that fevers came and went and sometimes killed you. Monroe caught those fevers, likely malaria, and they never fully let him go. Throughout his life, he suffered from recurring bouts of chills, sweats, weakness, and exhaustion that would knock him flat for days or weeks. Letters from friends and observers mention his intermittent fevers and prolonged periods of debility. Each attack stripped weight and strength from a man whose body was already carrying war wounds. By the time he reached the presidency, these fevers probably contributed to the impression of a tired, older leader drifting through an easy era, when in reality he was often simply drained. The Monroe Doctrine, the bold declaration warning Europe away from the Americas, was issued by a man whose own blood was periodically under siege from parasites, picked up years earlier in service to the same nation. Number 11. Andrew Jackson's dueling bullet wounds. Andrew Jackson turned his body into a kind of walking archive of American violence. By the time he reached the White House, he had at least 2 bullets permanently lodged inside him from duels and gunfights. One, from a notorious duel with Charles Dickinson in 1806, entered his chest near the heart and stayed there. Surgeons couldn't remove it safely, so Jackson simply lived with it, coughing blood when the weather changed, and feeling sharp pains deep in his ribs whenever he exerted himself. Another bullet sat in his arm from an earlier encounter. He was constantly at risk of infection, in an age before antibiotics, with metal and scar tissue embedded in his flesh. Visitors to the White House wrote about his gaunt appearance, his sallow skin, the way he seemed both wiry and strangely fragile, like a man held together more by rage and willpower than by muscle and bone. When he threatened enemies or shouted down opponents, he did it with every gesture tugging against the foreign objects that had been trying to kill him for decades. Number 12. Andrew Jackson's tuberculosis-like cough. On top of the bullets and old injuries, Jackson battled a chronic hacking cough that never really went away. For years he brought up blood, suffered night sweats, and endured periods of weakness that sound eerily like the textbook description of tuberculosis or a similar long-term lung disease. Diagnoses in his era were loose and often wrong, so historians can't be sure exactly what he had. But his letters and the accounts of those around him make it clear that his lungs were damaged badly enough that simple respiratory infections could become serious episodes. He coughed through cabinet meetings, through travel, through the strains of the bank war and the nullification crisis. Some days he seemed almost swallowed by the effort of breathing, then would erupt in bursts of temper that made everyone forget how sick he looked. The legend of Old Hickory paints him as indestructible. The reality is that the 7th president spent much of his life as a chronically ill man forcing willpower through scarred lungs, daring his own body to keep up with the fury of his politics. Number 13. Andrew Jackson's mercury treatment. As if bullets and bad lungs weren't enough, Andrew Jackson also spent years swallowing one of medicine's favorite poisons, mercury. His doctors prescribed calomel, a mercury-based compound that was the go-to remedy of the early 19th century for everything from constipation to biliousness. Jackson took it regularly, sometimes in heavy doses, trusting that it was purging his system of whatever evil humors were making him sick. Modern medicine looks back and quietly winces. Mercury can damage the kidneys, corrode the intestines, and affect mood and cognition, so that the cure slowly becomes its own disease. Some historians have wondered whether Jackson's erratic bursts of rage, his digestive misery, and his mysterious weak spells were quietly amplified by years of chronic mercury exposure masquerading as treatment. Old Hickory, the man of iron will, was being slowly seasoned with heavy metal by the best medical advice his era could offer. Number 14. Martin Van Buren's asthma rumors. After Jackson's storm, Martin Van Buren floated into the presidency like a careful lawyer trying not to disturb any furniture, but whispering around him were murmurs that he had a weak chest and a tendency to wheeze. Contemporary gossip suggested he suffered from asthma or some kind of chronic respiratory vulnerability, the kind of condition that might turn a dusty carriage ride or a cold, damp campaign stop into a genuine health scare. The surviving medical evidence is thin and mostly secondhand, so historians can't say with confidence that Van Buren was an asthmatic in the modern sense. But descriptions of him avoiding strenuous outdoor exertion, seeking comfort in warm rooms, and sometimes appearing short of breath fed a quiet narrative that the eighth president's polished calmness and methodical style were partly self-protection. In an age when a bout of bronchitis could spiral into something fatal, the careful, always composed little magician may have been very aware that his lungs were not interested in drama. Number 15. William Henry Harrison's White House illness. William Henry Harrison is famous mostly for two things: a long inauguration speech and a very short presidency. The traditional story says he rode to his inauguration in bad weather without a coat, delivered a marathon address in the cold, and promptly caught pneumonia that killed him a month later. It's a neat fable about hubris and exposure, but modern medical sleuths aren't convinced. Some argue his symptoms fit better with typhoid, or another infection picked up from contaminated water flowing through the White House's less than sanitary plumbing. In that reading, it wasn't the wind on his face that ended Harrison's life, but microbes in his drinking water. Either way, the ninth president spent most of his 31 days in office feverish, delirious, and in pain, while his doctors bled him, dosed him with opium and camphor, and tried to balance his humors. The presidency that began with a boastful display of toughness ended with a cautionary tale about how fragile the body of power can be. Number 16. John Tyler's recurrent dysentery. John Tyler slipped into the presidency after Harrison's death, a constitutional question mark in human form, and behind the political controversy his bowels were waging their own private rebellion. Throughout his adult life, Tyler suffered repeated episodes of what doctors called dysentery and violent looseness of the bowels, bouts of abdominal cramping, bloody diarrhea, and dehydration that could flatten him for days. In the 1840s, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a genuine threat. Washington's water was contaminated, food storage was primitive, and basic hand washing was a radical concept. Every attack meant risking long-term weakness or secondary infections. Letters mention him being indisposed with intestinal complaints at key moments, including during his years in office. The 10th president, remembered for annexing Texas and enraging much of Congress, sometimes conducted affairs of state with a chamber pot never far away, living proof that even in the highest office, you were still at the mercy of whatever lived in your drinking water. Number 17. James K. Polk's childhood bladder surgery. Long before James K. Polk promised to serve a single presidential term and then disappear, he was a sickly boy facing a nightmare procedure. As a teenager, he suffered from excruciating bladder stones, agonizing pain that left him unable to urinate properly and doubled him over for hours. The solution in the 1810s was surgery without anesthesia, using crude instruments in a world before germ theory. Polk underwent a perineal lithotomy, a brutal operation in which surgeons cut through the perineum to reach and remove the stone. He was restrained while awake as metal met flesh, then left to recover without modern pain control or antibiotics. The procedure almost certainly left him sterile, and perhaps partially incontinent, shaping a life with no biological children and possibly a lasting sense that the body is something to be endured, not trusted. When he later bore the strains of war, expansion, and political battles, he did so in a body that had already survived one of the most harrowing medical ordeals of his time. Number 18. James K. Polk's exhaustion in office. By the time Polk finally reached the presidency, he approached the job like a man racing a clock only he could hear. He set a punishing schedule, working from early morning until late at night, micromanaging details, reading dispatches, and pushing himself through crises of war with Mexico, territorial expansion, and domestic conflict. Visitors remarked on how gaunt he became, how his eyes seemed sunken, and his energy strangely wired, like a candle burning from both ends. Polk rarely took real vacations, ignored signs of strain, and treated rest as a luxury he couldn't afford. Modern observers suspect that the relentless pace worsened underlying health problems, possibly chronic gastrointestinal issues or cardiovascular strain, leaving him depleted by the time he left office. Within 3 months of stepping down, he was dead at 53, probably from cholera, or another severe infection hitting a body already wrung dry. The president, who expanded the map of the United States dramatically, may have done it, in part, by spending the last of his own strength. Number 19. Zachary Taylor's sudden gastrointestinal death. Zachary Taylor's presidency ended not with a bullet or a battlefield, but with something that sounded suspiciously like a bad picnic gone lethal. In July 1850, after attending 4th of July celebrations in brutal Washington heat, he reportedly wolfed down a mix of cherries, cold milk, and maybe some questionable water. Within hours, he was doubled over with abdominal pain, violent diarrhea, and relentless vomiting. For 5 days, doctors tried everything their era thought wise: bleeding, blistering, opiates, and calomel, the mercury cure-all. Taylor only got worse, dehydrated, feverish, and delirious until he died, officially of acute gastrointestinal illness, often labeled cholera morbus. Rumors later swirled that he'd been poisoned with arsenic over his stance on slavery's expansion, enough that his body was exhumed in 1991. Modern tests found no evidence of foul play, just the grim reality that in the 19th century, a stomach bug could kill a president in less than a week. Number 20. Millard Fillmore's lasting leg injury. Millard Fillmore slid into the presidency like a placeholder, quiet and careful, but his body carried a reminder of a more dangerous youth. Years before the White House, Fillmore reportedly suffered a serious riding accident, thrown or dragged in a way that left one leg injured badly enough to trouble him for decades. The exact medical notes are thin. No x-rays, no neat diagnosis, but accounts describe lingering pain, stiffness, and occasional lameness that flared with age and exertion. In a world before physical therapy, anti-inflammatories, or joint replacement, an old fracture or torn ligaments simply healed badly and stayed that way, a constant low drumbeat of discomfort. Some observers noticed his careful gait and preference for carriages over walking when distance was involved. The 13th president, often caricatured as bland, may have spent many days measuring his steps, balancing public duties against a private, nagging reminder that one wrong move on a horse could echo for a lifetime. Number 21. Franklin Pierce's mental health grief. Franklin Pierce came into office not as a triumphant victor, but as a shattered father pretending to govern through a fog. Just weeks before his inauguration, he and his wife witnessed a train accident that killed their 11-year-old son, Benjamin, before their eyes. He was their last surviving child. The trauma hollowed both parents. Pierce, already prone to melancholy and heavy drinking, plunged into a deeper despair. Letters suggest he viewed the presidency as a kind of punishment from God, not an honor, and his wife retreated into intense mourning, often absent from public life. Pierce's term was marked by indecision, bouts of withdrawal, and what modern observers might call major depression complicated by alcohol use. He struggled with insomnia, low energy, and a pervasive sense of doom as the country drifted towards civil war. The 14th president's inner life was dominated not by policy, but by replayed images of a railroad embankment and a child he could not save. Number 22. James Buchanan's strabismus and vision problems. James Buchanan entered the White House as the only lifelong bachelor president, but he also carried another visible peculiarity, a strikingly misaligned eye. From childhood, Buchanan had strabismus, one eye that turned noticeably inward, giving him an appearance that contemporaries sometimes mocked and others found disconcerting. In an era with no corrective surgery and no cosmetic lens tricks, he lived with poor depth perception and a visual field that never quite lined up. Simple tasks like climbing uneven steps, judging distances, or reading in low light could be quietly taxing. Some observers described him tilting his head or positioning himself carefully during conversations, likely instinctive adaptations to see people more clearly. In a political world obsessed with appearances and oratory, Buchanan's eye became an easy target for cruel caricatures and satire. Behind the jokes was a man who had to navigate crowded receptions, dimly lit chambers, and long document review with a constant visual handicap that never got better, only more noticeable with age. Number 23. James Buchanan's National Hotel Disease. As if crossed eyes weren't enough, the year James Buchanan became president nearly began and ended at the National Hotel in Washington. In the winter of 1857, while staying there before his inauguration, Buchanan was struck by a violent gastrointestinal illness that tore through the hotel's guests and staff. Dozens fell sick with vomiting, diarrhea, cramps, and debilitating weakness. Several died. The newspapers dubbed it National Hotel Disease, and rumors flew about poisoned food, hostile Southern agents, or some mysterious miasma rising from the sewers. Buchanan was hit particularly hard, confined to bed, reportedly emaciated and pale, and his recovery was slow and incomplete. Modern historians suspect contaminated water or a sewage leak leading to something like dysentery, norovirus, or chronic post-infectious bowel problems. Whatever the cause, the 15th president began his term weakened, frequently fatigued, and haunted by a strange outbreak that has never been definitively explained, a reminder that even the president-elect could be laid flat by whatever lurked in the hotel pipes. Number 24. Abraham Lincoln's Marfan Syndrome debate. Abraham Lincoln's long limbs, narrow face, and towering, awkward frame have inspired more than just political cartoons. They've prompted a medical mystery. Some researchers have proposed that Lincoln displayed the features of Marfan syndrome, a genetic connective tissue disorder marked by unusual height, lanky proportions, long fingers, flexible joints, and potential heart and eye problems. Lincoln's photographs show a gaunt, elongated man with sloping shoulders, large hands, and a chest that some think hints at skeletal deformity. Supporters of the theory point to accounts of his clumsiness and occasional chest discomfort as circumstantial evidence. Others argue that he functioned too robustly, wrestling, riding, enduring years of stress for someone with serious Marfan complications, and note that no definitive family pattern has been documented. Without DNA from direct descendants, it remains an educated guess, not a diagnosis. So the 16th president stands in history as both emancipator and anatomical riddle, his body inviting modern labels he never knew in life. Number 25. Abraham Lincoln's profound melancholy. Abraham Lincoln didn't just look gaunt and haunted in photographs. People who knew him described a man living with a permanent shadow inside. Long before he reached the White House, Lincoln had what his contemporaries called melancholy, and what modern psychiatry might label major depressive disorder. Friends recalled him collapsing into weeks of despondency, unable to eat, prone to tears, speaking openly of death and sometimes of not wanting to live. Twice in his younger years, those around him were so worried they removed razors and knives from his reach. As president, the burdens of civil war, mounting casualties, and his own personal losses, including the death of his beloved son Willie in 1862, deepened that internal weight. Yet Lincoln learned to work with his darkness rather than outrun it, using humor as a pressure valve, immersing himself in work, and channeling his bleak realism into an almost brutal clarity about the costs of war. His private despair sat behind the calm, measured speeches that tried to hold a broken country together. Number 26. Abraham Lincoln's Civil War smallpox scare. In the final months of 1863, while the Civil War was still ripping the country apart, Abraham Lincoln quietly came down with something more personal, a form of smallpox. Doctors at the time called it varioloid, a milder version that struck him shortly after delivering the Gettysburg Address. He developed fever, headache, and a rash that progressed into pox lesions, the kind of illness that could easily have been deadly in a different era or in a more severe form. For weeks he was fatigued, contagious, and in pain, reportedly so weak at one point that aides feared for his life. Yet even sick and quarantined in the White House, he continued signing documents, seeing a trickle of visitors, and making decisions about troop movements and wartime policy. Some accounts suggest that staff who cared for him may have caught the disease, and there were hushed worries about an outbreak at the very center of government. The public got only vague references to his ill health, while behind closed doors, the commander-in-chief wondered if a virus might succeed where Confederate bullets had failed. Number 27. Andrew Johnson's vascular decline and stroke. Andrew Johnson, the tailor's son who stumbled into the presidency after Lincoln's assassination, left office battered by impeachment battles and public loathing, but his body held a quieter, more relentless enemy. Like many men of his era, he carried untreated vascular risks, years of heavy drinking, poor diet, and chronic stress written in the background of his middle age. After his tumultuous presidency, he tried to claw his way back into political life and eventually returned to the Senate, older, grayer, and visibly worn. In 1875, while traveling in Tennessee, Johnson suffered what we'd now recognize as a major stroke. He collapsed with sudden weakness and difficulty speaking, partially paralyzed and unable to move one side of his body. Doctors could do little beyond offering rest, stimulants, and watchful waiting. He lingered for a short time, more destroyed by a clot or bleed in his brain than by any congressional vote, and died days later. His end underscored something invisible in the portraits, decades of uncontrolled blood pressure and vascular strain that finally burst through in one catastrophic moment. Number 28. Ulysses S. Grant's agonizing throat cancer. Ulysses S. Grant won the Civil War with grit, persistence, and a cigar almost permanently lodged between his teeth. By some estimates, he smoked as many as 20 a day, a habit he joked about but never abandoned. In the early 1880s, years after leaving the presidency, Grant began noticing a soreness in his throat that wouldn't go away, difficulty swallowing, and pain that made eating a slow, miserable task. Doctors eventually diagnosed cancer of the throat and tongue, most likely squamous cell carcinoma, the classic punishment for a lifetime of tobacco. Treatment options were barbarically limited: caustic applications, crude surgeries, opiates for the pain. He grew thin and gaunt, his once booming voice reduced to a hoarse whisper, every swallow a trial. Financially ruined by bad investments, he forced himself to keep working through the agony, racing against death to finish his memoirs so his family would have money. He wrote wrapped in blankets, sipping morphine, spitting blood between pages. Grant died in 1885, but his book became a classic, a final campaign fought sentence by sentence against a disease he had unknowingly courted for decades. Number 29. Ulysses S. Grant's wartime headaches. Long before cancer silenced him, Ulysses S. Grant's brain had its own way of registering the unbearable pressure he lived under. During the Civil War, Grant was notorious for his calm under fire, a general who seemed almost unshakable as shells fell and men died around him. But privately he was plagued by vicious headaches that often struck at the most intense moments of command. Before and during major battles, he'd be hit with pounding pain, sensitivity to light, and a kind of mental fog that sounds suspiciously like migraine attacks triggered by stress, lack of sleep, and constant strain. He sometimes retreated to darkened tents, pressing his head in his hands, riding out the pain while staff officers tiptoed around him. Yet he kept issuing orders, forcing himself to focus through the throbbing. The headaches didn't stop him from winning, but they added a hidden layer to the cost of victory, a commander whose skull felt like it was being hammered from the inside every time the nation demanded another turning point. Number 30. Rutherford B. Hayes's lingering childhood arm injury. Rutherford B. Hayes, the bearded, compromised president who tiptoed America out of Reconstruction, carried an old, mostly invisible injury that dated back to a less guarded childhood. As a boy, he reportedly suffered a serious accident. Accounts differ on the exact cause, a fall or mishap that badly damaged one of his arms. In an age without orthopedic surgeons, physical therapy, or even decent splints, the limb healed crooked, stiff, and weaker than it should have been. For the rest of his life, Hayes managed around reduced strength and range of motion, compensating with the other arm, adjusting how he wrote, rode, and handled daily tasks. Later battlefield wounds in the Civil War added more scars, but that early injury had already set limits on what his body could do. In portraits and public events, he presented the image of a sturdy, outdoorsy gentleman, but simple acts like lifting heavy objects, fencing, or even shaking too many hands could bring back numbness, aching, or fatigue in that damaged arm. The 19th president's physical presence, like his politics, was a series of quiet compromises with past damage nobody really talked about. Number 31. James A. Garfield's swamp-bred malaria. James A. Garfield didn't just grow up in the rough physical world of canal work and Ohio farm life, he grew up in mosquito country. In the mid-19th century, large stretches of the Midwest were still dotted with stagnant pools and half-drained marshes, the perfect breeding grounds for Anopheles mosquitoes carrying malaria. Garfield, like countless Americans of his class and region, had periodic fever and ague episodes as a younger man, chills, high fevers, drenching sweats, and bone-deep exhaustion that would lay him out for days. Doctors at the time blamed miasmas and bad air, but what he likely had were recurrent malarial flares, the parasite reactivating whenever stress, poor diet, or another illness weakened him. These bouts didn't vanish just because he put on better suits and moved into the halls of Congress. By the time he became president, Garfield's body had already been through years of cyclical illness, each fever another unrecorded skirmish in a lifetime war between his immune system and an invisible invader that no one really understood. Number 32. James A. Garfield's fatal infection after the bullet. When Charles Guiteau fired at President James A. Garfield in a Washington train station in July 1881, the bullet didn't kill him outright. By modern trauma standards, Garfield's initial wounds were serious but survivable. The real damage came from what happened next. In an era before germ theory was fully accepted in American practice, his doctors repeatedly probed the wound with unwashed fingers and unsterilized instruments, hunting for a bullet they never actually needed to find. They introduced bacteria deep into his body, turning a penetrating injury into a slow-burning septic nightmare. For weeks, Garfield lay in sweltering rooms, racked with fevers, chills, and relentless pain, his weight dropping as abscesses formed along his spine and in his internal organs. Pus tracked through tissue planes, his body literally rotting from the inside while his physicians insisted they were saving him. By the time he died in September, it was less the assassin's marksmanship and more the medical care itself, the infection, the neglect of basic cleanliness, that turned a wounded president into a dying one. Number 33. Chester A. Arthur's secret battle with Bright's disease. Chester A. Arthur stepped into the presidency, wearing fine clothes, impressive whiskers, and a carefully cultivated image of robust health, but his kidneys were quietly failing him. By the early 1880s, he was living with Bright's disease, a catch-all 19th century term that generally meant chronic kidney inflammation, what modern medicine might call glomerulonephritis or advanced nephropathy. Symptoms crept in slowly: fatigue that wouldn't lift with rest, swelling in his legs and hands, headaches, shortness of breath, and episodes of high blood pressure that left him feeling weak and ill. His doctors knew enough to recognize that his condition was serious and likely progressive, but in a culture that treated presidential health as a state secret, they and Arthur kept it quiet. He took extended trips, including a much-publicized journey to Yellowstone and the West, officially for recreation but also in desperate hope that rest and a change of air might slow his decline. Behind the scenes, he napped through afternoons, missed meetings, and struggled to climb stairs, a man whose public authority masked a body being slowly poisoned by its own failing filtration system. Number 34. Grover Cleveland's yacht-side secret cancer surgery. Grover Cleveland vanished from public view in the summer of 1893 at one of the worst possible moments. A financial panic was rocking the country, and anxiety was high. Officially, the White House said the president was simply taking a brief vacation to recover from dental issues and fatigue. In reality, Cleveland had a suspicious lesion on the roof of his mouth and upper jaw, a growth doctors feared might be cancerous. Terrified that news of a sick president would further rattle the already shaken markets, his team arranged a remarkably secretive operation aboard a friend's yacht as it sailed the East River and Long Island Sound. Surgeons, working in near silence on the gently rocking vessel, removed a substantial portion of his upper left jaw and palate through his mouth, leaving no external scar. Ether, rudimentary instruments, and the limited anesthesia of the day were all they had. When Cleveland resurfaced, he spoke a little differently and looked subtly altered. But the country was told nothing beyond vague references to dental work, while the reality, presidential oral cancer surgery, stayed hidden for years. Number 35. Grover Cleveland's hidden jaw of rubber and skill. After surgeons carved out part of Grover Cleveland's upper jaw to remove the tumor, he was left with more than just a medical problem. He had a political one. A president who couldn't speak clearly or eat normally would signal weakness, and in the 19th century, any visible deformity could become a target for ridicule and fear. To solve this, a skilled prosthodontist crafted a custom rubber prosthesis that fit into the cavity where bone and tissue had been removed. This device restored some of his facial contour, supported his mustache and upper lip, and allowed his tongue to form sounds more normally, giving him back a plausible speaking voice. It had to be carefully adjusted over time, cleaned, and refitted as his mouth healed and changed shape. Cleveland learned to slip it in and out discreetly, to speak at just the right pace, so consonants wouldn't slur, and to eat in ways that minimized awkward chewing or choking. Every public speech, every cabinet meeting, every photograph of a stern, solid president rested on that hidden piece of rubber, bridging the gap between illness and illusion. Number 36. Benjamin Harrison's slow collapse after influenza. Benjamin Harrison's final act on the historical stage was not a dramatic assassination or a battlefield death, but a steady, suffocating decline brought on by an infection the world still underestimates. In February and March of 1901, years after he left the White House, Harrison developed what was described as a severe cold that rapidly evolved into influenza and pneumonia. At a time when antibiotics did not exist, influenza was not a passing inconvenience but a coin toss between recovery and respiratory failure, especially for older adults. Harrison's lungs filled with fluid, each breath becoming shallower and more labored. Fevers left him delirious and weak, and what began as grip progressed into a full-blown bronchial pneumonia, his chest rattling with every exhale. Doctors tried oxygen tents, poultices, stimulants, and the usual Victorian assortment of tonics, but they could not reverse the inflammation and fluid choking his airways. Over days, his strength ebbed away, his heart straining against the lack of oxygen until it simply could not keep up. A former president, once the center of a continental government, died effectively of complications from what many would still call just the flu. Number 37. William McKinley's whispered epileptic fits. William McKinley moved through public life with the calm, unruffled demeanor of a small-town lawyer promoted onto the world stage. But underneath that polished exterior, rumors swirled about something more alarming. Some contemporaries, and later a few historians, suggested that McKinley might have suffered from epileptic seizures earlier in his life, episodes of sudden collapse, blank staring, or strange automatisms that his family and doctors allegedly worked hard to keep out of the official record. In an era when epilepsy was deeply stigmatized, considered by many a sign of weakness, madness, or even moral failing, any hint that a president might have such a condition would have been politically explosive. The supposed evidence is scattered and circumstantial, vague references to nervous spells, anxious efforts to shield him from public embarrassment, and a culture of secrecy about bodily frailty that was standard for 19th century politicians. No surviving, airtight medical documentation confirms a diagnosis, and later biographers have been divided, some dismissing the idea outright, others treating it as a plausible but unprovable explanation for stories that never quite made it into the sanitized official version of his life. Number 38. Theodore Roosevelt's asthmatic nights of terror. Before Theodore Roosevelt became the mythic Rough Rider charging up San Juan Hill, he was a frail, wheezing child whose nights were haunted by asthma. In the cramped, smoky air of 19th century New York City, his tiny bronchial tubes would clamp down without warning, his chest tightening as if an invisible belt were being cinched around his ribs. He would sit up in bed, gasping, shoulders hunched, eyes wide with the primal panic of suffocation, while his desperate parents tried anything: steam, open windows in winter, carriage rides to fresh air, mustard plasters, to get him through another attack. Doctors told his family that nothing much could be done, that his constitution was weak, that they should expect a short, limited life for their son. Roosevelt, famously stubborn even as a boy, took that prognosis as a personal insult. As he grew older, he designed his own program of physical training, vigorous exercise, horseback riding, boxing, hiking, determined to build his body into a shield against the lungs that had nearly betrayed him. The asthma never entirely disappeared, but the sickly child learned to live as though he could outrun the disease chasing him from his earliest memories. Number 39. Theodore Roosevelt's blinded eye in the boxing ring. In the White House, Theodore Roosevelt liked to present himself as the embodiment of robust American masculinity, and that meant not just hunting trips and long hikes, but full contact sport. Even as president, he boxed regularly with military aides, friends, and occasionally visiting champions, stubbornly refusing to accept that the commander-in-chief might have something to lose by stepping into the ring. During one of those bouts, accounts differ on the exact opponent, he took a sharp, heavy blow to the face, a straight punch that sent a jolt of pain through his skull and left his right eye seeing stars. At first, he brushed it off as just another bruise, another badge of honor in his cult of toughness, but over the following months his vision in that eye began to fade. The retina had been damaged, slowly detaching, and there was nothing early 20th century medicine could do to reverse it. Roosevelt quietly stopped boxing, shifting to judo and other pursuits, and told almost no one what had happened. Later, he admitted almost casually that he had gone essentially blind in one eye while play fighting in the executive mansion. Another reminder that the myth of invincibility he cultivated had a very real, irreversible cost. Number 40. Theodore Roosevelt's Amazonian fevers and the slow unraveling. After leaving the presidency, Theodore Roosevelt, restless and hungry for new tests of endurance, decided that what he really needed was a brutal river expedition through the unexplored Amazon. The River of Doubt journey in 1913-14 was supposed to be a grand adventure. It turned into a prolonged medical disaster. Roosevelt injured his leg early on, the wound becoming infected in the hot, insect-ridden jungle, while clouds of mosquitoes and other parasites feasted on the entire party. He developed high, swinging fevers, chills that shook his whole body, and waves of delirium that left him raving on his cot as the river crept on beneath them. Contemporary accounts describe suspected malaria, possibly other tropical infections, and a sepsis-like exhaustion that nearly killed him on the riverbank. At one point, he reportedly told companions to leave him behind. They did not, and he was carried, half-conscious, out of the rainforest. Roosevelt eventually made it home, but he never truly recovered. The Amazon left him with chronic weakness, recurrent fevers, and a visibly diminished vitality. The once tireless dynamo aged almost overnight, his remaining years shaped by an invisible burden of infection and organ damage acquired in a jungle he insisted on conquering. Number 41. William Howard Taft's Silent Nights of Stopped Breathing. William Howard Taft is often remembered for his size as a punchline, but his massive frame likely hid something much more serious than jokes about bathtubs. Contemporary records put his weight well over 300 pounds during parts of his career, combined with a thick neck, a tendency to doze off in meetings, and reports of thunderous snoring and morning fatigue. Put together, modern physicians see the almost textbook picture of obstructive sleep apnea, a condition barely understood in his own time. In sleep apnea, the soft tissues of the throat collapse during sleep, blocking airflow and causing repeated episodes of oxygen deprivation throughout the night. The sleeper may never fully awaken but cycles through gasping, micro-arousals, and fragmented rest, straining the heart and blood vessels. Taft complained of exhaustion, struggled with high blood pressure, and was known to nod off in public settings, all signs that his nights were not the restorative escape they should have been. No doctor of his era would have used the term sleep apnea, and there is no definitive diagnosis, but looking back, the pattern is hard to miss, a president likely suffocating in tiny increments every time he closed his eyes. Number 42. William Howard Taft's public war against his own weight. Long before modern politicians hired nutritionists and personal trainers to quietly sculpt their images, William Howard Taft's body was headline news, and he knew it. Taft, Painfully aware of both the health risks and the relentless public mockery tied to his size, embarked on one of the earliest and most documented presidential weight loss campaigns. He corresponded extensively with British diet guru Dr. Nathaniel York Davies, submitting to a strict regimen that emphasized calorie control, regular weigh-ins, and detailed reporting of what he ate and how much he exercised. Taft's letters read like a mixture of confession and medical log. He recorded fluctuations in pounds, laps walked, meals skipped, and periodic relapses into overeating when stress or travel disrupted his plans. At various points, he lost significant amounts of weight, dozens of pounds, only to see some of it creep back, the familiar cycle of resolve and regression that defines so many diets even today. The campaign was unusually public for its time, with newspapers sometimes speculating about his numbers and stamina, turning his private struggle with appetite and metabolism into a kind of national spectator sport. Behind the jokes about his girth was a man methodically and imperfectly fighting a chronic condition with the limited tools his era could offer. Number 43. Woodrow Wilson's Secret 1919 Stroke and the Shadow Presidency. Woodrow Wilson went to Paris after World War I determined to personally remake the world order, but the strain of travel, negotiation, and unrelenting political combat fell on a body that was already fragile. In October 1919, back in Washington and exhausted from a grueling cross-country speaking tour to sell the League of Nations, the president suffered a massive stroke in the White House. The left side of his body weakened or paralyzed, his vision impaired, his emotions volatile, his capacity to process complex information gravely diminished. In a modern era, he would have been placed under intensive neurological care and very likely declared incapable of fully discharging his duties. In 1919, that outcome was politically unthinkable. Instead, the White House closed ranks. Access to Wilson was tightly controlled. Official bulletins described nervous exhaustion and indisposition, not a catastrophic cerebrovascular event. First Lady Edith Wilson and a small circle of aides became the gatekeepers, deciding which papers, decisions, and visitors would reach the bedridden president. Edith later described her role as a stewardship, but contemporaries and later scholars have debated whether, for months, she was effectively acting as an unelected chief executive. Cabinet members were kept at arm's length. The vice president was not invited to step in, and Congress was largely left guessing at Wilson's true condition. In an era with no constitutional mechanism like the 25th Amendment, the United States quietly drifted through a period when its elected leader was gravely disabled, and the public was told almost nothing about the scale of his impairment. Number 44. Woodrow Wilson's earlier minor strokes and the warnings ignored. Woodrow Wilson did not arrive at his 1919 collapse as a perfectly healthy man suddenly struck down by fate. His nervous system had likely been sounding alarms for years. Long before the massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed, doctors and colleagues noted episodes of severe headaches, transient visual disturbances, odd numbness, and periods of emotional volatility that went beyond ordinary stress. Some historians and neurologists, reading the fragments of medical notes and personal correspondence that survive, believe Wilson may have suffered a series of smaller vascular events, transient ischemic attacks, or minor strokes during and even before his presidency. These brief disruptions of blood flow to the brain can produce momentary blindness, clumsiness, slurred speech, or personality shifts that clear up quickly, leaving only fatigue and a sense that something undefined has gone wrong. In the early 20th century, such episodes were often written off as nervousness or overwork, diagnoses that conveniently required little more than rest and stoicism. Wilson's doctors were cautious but deferential, torn between medical concern and the immense pressure not to brand a sitting president as neurologically unstable. The pattern, viewed with modern eyes, is unsettling. A man already prone to migraines and high blood pressure pushed himself through the strain of war leadership and international diplomacy, accumulating silent damage until his brain could no longer compensate. The minor incidents never received a formal label in his lifetime, and there is no definitive posthumous diagnosis. But the cumulative portrait is of a presidency haunted by a hidden, progressive cerebrovascular vulnerability that was easier, in his own era, to euphemize than to confront. Number 45. Warren G. Harding's quietly failing heart on the road. Warren G. Harding cultivated the image of a relaxed, affable leader, the kind of president who looked more at home on a front porch than in a war room, but behind the easy smile, his cardiovascular system was under visible strain. By the early 1920s, he was in his late 50s, carrying extra weight, smoking, and living with high blood pressure at a time when hypertension was poorly understood and essentially untreated. He complained of chest discomfort, fatigue, and episodes of shortness of breath. Doctors noted an enlarged heart and murmurs that hinted at underlying disease. Yet the presidency demanded travel, and in 1923 Harding embarked on the Voyage of Understanding, a long tour across the country and up to Alaska meant to reconnect with the public and perhaps outrun the growing whispers of scandal swirling around his administration. The schedule was punishing: speeches, receptions, endless train rides, irregular meals. Along the way, he developed severe indigestion, labored breathing, and what we would now recognize as cardiac warning signs, but his physicians alternated between reassuring language and vague warnings about nervousness and diet. In late July in Alaska and then on the return to the West Coast, he began to visibly falter. On August 2, 1923, in a San Francisco hotel, Harding collapsed and died suddenly. The official cause was announced as a stroke or apoplexy, but many modern cardiologists, looking at the pattern of symptoms, have argued that he more likely succumbed to a heart attack or lethal arrhythmia brought on by long-standing coronary artery disease. No autopsy was performed, leaving the exact diagnosis forever uncertain, but the broad outline is clear. A president with significant, poorly managed heart trouble pushed through a grueling tour until his cardiovascular system simply gave out far from home. Number 46, Warren G. Harding's chronic indigestion and the pain that wasn't just in his stomach. Long before Warren G. Harding's final days in San Francisco, stomach complaints were a recurring character in his life story. Friends, aides, and newspaper accounts mentioned his indigestion, his tendency to suffer after meals, his reliance on tonics, antacids, and the sort of home remedies that passed for gastrointestinal care in the 1920s. On his last cross-country tour, these complaints intensified. Harding reported burning in his chest, pain after eating, nausea, and a restless discomfort that followed him from train car to podium and back again. His doctors diagnosed ptomaine poisoning and acute indigestion, common catch-all labels of the era that conveniently suggested a temporary foodborne problem rather than a systemic disease. Looking back, those symptoms map uncomfortably well onto what modern medicine recognizes as angina, chest pain caused by restricted blood flow to the heart, often misinterpreted as heartburn or gastric distress. At stops along the route, Harding sometimes looked pale and drawn, leaning on podiums, shortening remarks, skipping engagements with the explanation that his digestion was acting up. In Vancouver, and then on the trip down the coast, he grew markedly weaker, collapsing at least once, and retreating to his cabin with the shades drawn while staff fretted and his physician tinkered with diets and rest schedules. When he died, the narrative of stomach problems gave way to the announcement of a sudden cerebral event, but the persistent pattern of digestive complaints suggests that his gastrointestinal discomfort may have been the body's way of screaming about a heart in crisis. Whether the pain truly originated in his stomach or was referred from the heart, Harding's chronic indigestion became the misleading soundtrack to a cardiovascular disaster that doctors of his day were ill-equipped to interpret. Number 47. Calvin Coolidge's quiet descent into grief after his son's death. Calvin Coolidge entered the White House with the reputation of a man of few words, Silent Cal who preferred stillness to spectacle, but the silence deepened into something darker after a sudden family tragedy in 1924. His teenage son, Calvin Jr., developed a blister on his foot while playing tennis on the White House courts, an ordinary injury that became anything but. Infection set in, and in an age before widespread antibiotics, the bacteria spread rapidly through his bloodstream, leading to sepsis. Within days, the healthy boy was feverish, delirious, and beyond the reach of available medicine. He died at 16, leaving the president and first lady shattered. Coolidge wrote later that when he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him, a rare admission of emotional devastation from a man who normally cloaked his feelings in understatement. Observers noticed a marked change. The president, always reserved, became more withdrawn, his already cautious energy dipping even lower. He slept more, took less evident pleasure in politics, and seemed to move through the duties of office with the flat affect of someone performing a role by habit rather than desire. Modern psychologists, reading the accounts, See the outlines of clinical depression, loss of interest, fatigue, emotional numbing, pervasive sadness that he rarely named aloud. In the 1920s, there was no concept of grief counseling for a sitting president, no language of mental health treatment that would have made it acceptable for him to step back and heal. Instead, Coolidge carried the weight of his son's death quietly through the remaining years of his term, his public stoicism concealing private nights in a White House, haunted by a boy who had walked its halls only months before. Number 48. Herbert Hoover's medicine ball mornings and the science of presidential fitness. Herbert Hoover is often remembered for breadlines and bank failures, but before the Great Depression defined his legacy, he tried to engineer his own health with the same methodical zeal he once brought to mining projects. In the late 1920s, concerned about the effects of long hours, high stress, and sedentary meetings on his body, Hoover worked with his physician, Admiral Joel Boone, to design a structured exercise routine that could be squeezed into the confines of the White House grounds. The result was a daily ritual sometimes called Hoover Ball, a hybrid of tennis, volleyball, and calisthenics played with a heavy medicine ball. At dawn, Hoover and a small group of aides and Secret Service agents would gather on the South Lawn, hurling the weighted ball over a net, lunging, twisting, and jumping in a surprisingly demanding workout that left participants panting and soaked in sweat before breakfast. Boone tracked Hoover's weight, pulse, and endurance, tweaking the intensity like a coach managing an athlete, aiming to control not just waistline but blood pressure and general resilience. The president embraced the routine as both physical therapy and psychological buffer, a way to discharge tension in a controlled quasi-medical setting rather than through smoking, drinking, or late-night pacing. Newspapers occasionally mentioned the odd spectacle of the commander-in-chief playing an invented game with a giant ball, usually casting it as a quirky human interest story. Behind the novelty was an early example of physician-guided executive fitness, a recognition that the strain of the office demanded intentional countermeasures. Hoover's medicine ball mornings did not protect him from the political and economic storms that would soon crash over his administration, but they show a president trying, within the limits of his time, to treat his own body as a system that could be measured, managed, and kept from breaking under pressure. Number 49. Franklin D. Roosevelt's polio paralysis and the art of presidential stagecraft. Franklin Roosevelt's public image was built on motion, train whistles, whistle-stop tours, jaunty waves from the back of open cars, but the reality beneath the performance was a body profoundly altered by disease. In 1921, at age 39, long before the White House and the New Deal, Roosevelt was struck by a sudden illness at a summer retreat in Campobello. Within days, his legs were weak, then useless, pain, fever, and paralysis descended. Doctors eventually settled on poliomyelitis, the viral infection that could devastate the spinal cord, though some modern scholars have proposed alternative diagnoses like Guillain-Barré syndrome. Whatever the label, the effect was stark. Roosevelt, once athletic and vigorous, was left unable to walk without heavy steel braces locked at the knees and the support of canes or strong arms. In an era when disability was often equated with weakness and incapacity, a politician with paralyzed legs faced an unforgiving political calculus. Roosevelt's solution was not to deny the paralysis. He lived with it every day, but to choreograph public life so it rarely appeared on camera or in print. He trained obsessively, learning to swing his hips and shoulders in a carefully practiced walk that, with help, could carry him a few steps across a room. Ramps were built into speaking platforms, handrails discreetly added. The Secret Service and aides became expert in subtle support, ready hands that steadied him so quickly it could seem like a casual gesture. Photographers were discouraged, then effectively forbidden, from taking pictures of the president being lifted, wheeled, or visibly braced. Newsreels showed him seated at desks, in cars, at naval reviews, his upper body animated, his lower body out of frame. Millions of Americans knew he had had polio, but the daily reality of his paralysis was blurred into a vague story of past illness rather than a continuing disability. The stagecraft worked. To many, Roosevelt appeared vigorous, active, a man who had conquered misfortune and returned stronger. Behind the podiums and desktops, though, the president's day was measured in transfers from wheelchair to chair, from chair to car, a constant, quiet negotiation with a virus that had stolen his legs but not his political will. Number 50. Franklin D. Roosevelt's hidden heart failure in the middle of a world war. By the time Franklin Roosevelt won his fourth term in 1944, he was not the same man who had breezed into office in 1933, with cigarette holder tilted jauntily and voice booming through the radio. 12 years of economic crisis and global war had carved into his body. His face was thinner, his movements slower, his breath sometimes a little short as he spoke. The public explanation was simple: the burden of leadership, the weight of history. Inside the medical files his doctors guarded, the story was more ominous. In early 1944, a cardiologist named Howard Bruin examined the president and found severely elevated blood pressure, an enlarged heart, signs of congestive failure, the heart struggling to pump effectively, fluid backing up in the lungs and tissues. In modern terms, Roosevelt was a man with advanced cardiovascular disease sitting at the center of wartime strategy, flying to Tehran and Yalta while his circulatory system frayed. The medical prescriptions were textbook for the era: rest, salt restriction, digitalis to strengthen the heartbeat. The political prescriptions were something else entirely. Publicly admitting that the commander-in-chief was in serious heart failure, facing a shortened life expectancy, could have reshaped the 1944 election, rattled Allied morale, and emboldened enemies. So the language remained gentle, euphemistic, tired, run down, overworked. Official bulletins emphasized that his heart was sound, even as his cardiologist tracked worrisome readings and adjusted medications. At Yalta in February 1945, photographs show a man who looks older than his 63 years, gaunt and slumped in his chair among the other Allied leaders, yet the American public received only reassuring statements about his stamina and resolve. The secrecy persisted right up to his sudden death in April 1945 from a massive cerebral hemorrhage, likely the final catastrophic turn of the same vascular disease his doctors had been quietly treating. Only later, when Bruin published details of Roosevelt's condition, did historians and physicians fully appreciate how close to the edge the president had been in those final wartime months, and how carefully that reality had been managed to preserve confidence in a leader whose heart was literally failing, even as he steered a global conflict. Number 51. Franklin D. Roosevelt's hypertension numbers that would terrify a modern clinic. Blood pressure in Roosevelt's era was something a kindly family doctor might mention in passing, not the relentlessly tracked, medicated vital sign it has become in modern medicine. For Franklin Roosevelt, that historical gap was not abstract. Surviving records from his final years show blood pressure readings that, today, would set off alarms and trigger emergency referrals. Numbers like 230/120, documented more than once, indicate severe malignant hypertension, a state in which the arteries are under such constant punishing pressure that the risk of stroke, heart failure, and kidney damage spikes dramatically. In the 1940s, before effective antihypertensive drugs existed, the treatment menu was thin: rest, hopeful diets, sedatives, vague advice to avoid strain. Roosevelt, however, was living in the opposite of a restful environment. He was up late, smoking, drinking cocktails with advisors, reading dispatches from battlefields, making decisions about invasions and alliances. His physicians tried to create pockets of recuperation, trips to warm springs, shorter days, enforced naps, but the pressures of wartime leadership kept bleeding into every carefully scheduled rest period. As his hypertension worsened, subtle signs appeared. He lost weight not through virtuous dieting, but through the wasting that can accompany chronic illness. His energy fluctuated, sometimes sharp, sometimes dull and distant. Observers at the time described him as looking old and tired, but few outside his inner circle grasped how dangerous the numbers on his blood pressure chart had become. In a contemporary emergency room, a patient with Roosevelt's readings and medical history would likely be admitted, monitored intensively, and bombarded with potent medications to push those numbers down quickly. In Roosevelt's White House, the same readings were handwritten into a chart that remained locked away, while press releases soothed the public with talk of a mild sinus infection or temporary fatigue. The disconnect between the clinical reality and the public narrative illustrates how a sitting president's physiology can be quietly out of sync with the image of unstoppable leadership projected to a nation, and how hypertension, silent, invisible, can grind away at even the most iconic of political lives. Number 52. Harry S. Truman's nearsighted world behind those thick, round glasses. Harry Truman came to the presidency suddenly, Summoned to the White House after Franklin Roosevelt's death, a comparatively unknown senator from Missouri who had spent much of his life peering at the world through lenses that were, by all accounts, very strong. As a boy, Truman wanted to attend West Point and pursue a military career, but his eyesight failed the stringent entrance standards. Without glasses, he could barely see the large E on an eye chart. The thick spectacles that became his trademark were not a fashion choice but a medical necessity, correcting significant myopia that blurred faces, documents, and landscapes into indistinct shapes. In an age when children with poor vision were often dismissed as clumsy or slow, Truman found his way to compensation. He read voraciously, sat close to the front in school, and embraced his reputation as a bookish, diligent student rather than an athlete. By the time he reached politics, the glasses had become part of his persona. The earnest, bespectacled man from Independence who looked more like a bank clerk than a battlefield general. Truman himself joked about his poor eyesight, telling stories of how he had to memorize bus routes and rely on friends to point out distant landmarks. But the underlying reality that a future president's world depended on carefully ground glass and regular checkups rarely registered as a vulnerability in the public imagination. He was not blind, not incapacitated, simply someone whose eyes needed technological help to function. At the same time, there was an unspoken contingency hovering in the background. A lost pair of glasses on a battlefield, a broken lens during a crisis, could have turned his famous decisiveness into something more tentative. Instead, with multiple backups and careful habits, Truman turned a potential liability into a visual shorthand for seriousness. The man with the thick round frames might not look glamorous, but he could read every dense briefing and fine print clause dropped on his desk, a reminder that some presidential weaknesses become, with time, part of the reassuring furniture of their public image. Number 53. Harry S. Truman's aching gallbladder and the surgery he finally couldn't avoid. During his presidency, Harry Truman was more likely to talk about budget deficits than bodily discomfort, but his digestive system had opinions of its own. For years, even while in office, he experienced intermittent bouts of upper abdominal pain, the kind that starts as a dull ache under the ribs and sometimes flares into sharp, cramping attacks that can radiate into the back or shoulder. In an era before routine ultrasound imaging, such pains were often chalked up to indigestion, gastritis, or the ever-popular nerves. Truman, who loved hearty Midwestern food and kept erratic political hours, fit easily into that diagnostic box. Behind the vague labels, though, gallstones were likely forming in his gallbladder, small, hard deposits that can intermittently block the flow of bile and provoke episodes of misery after meals. Only after he left the White House, with the relentless pressures of office behind him and the pain still returning, did doctors push for more definitive answers. By the mid-1950s, surgical removal of the gallbladder, cholecystectomy, had become a well-established treatment for recurrent gallstone disease, though still a major operation requiring a sizable abdominal incision and extended recovery. Truman agreed, undergoing surgery that finally addressed the problem that had probably stalked him quietly through cabinet meetings and state dinners. Because he was no longer president, the procedure unfolded largely outside the glare of international headlines. Reports were respectful, but not breathless, the convalescence private. Yet his case sits at an interesting juncture in presidential medical history. Earlier presidents had shielded even severe illnesses from view, while later ones would face intense scrutiny over everything from colon polyps to jogging routines. Truman's gallbladder and its ultimate removal occupied a middle space, a real chronic problem, managed with stoic understatement during his term, then definitively treated once the political stakes had eased, a reminder that some of the pains presidents carry through office are not metaphors but literal, untreated pathology. Number 54. Dwight D. Eisenhower's 1955 heart attack and the new era of telling the public the truth. Dwight Eisenhower arrived in the Oval Office with a general's bearing and a reputation for physical stamina forged in the crucible of World War II. He golfed, he smoked, he handled long days with the calm of someone who had once coordinated invasions. Yet by 1955, his arteries were quietly narrowing under the combined assault of stress, age, and tobacco. In September of that year, while vacationing in Colorado, Eisenhower developed what he first described as indigestion after a day of golf and meetings. The discomfort did not fade. Through the night, the pain worsened, spreading in a pattern that made his physician, Howard Snyder, increasingly uneasy. By morning, an electrocardiogram made the diagnosis clear. The President of the United States was in the midst of a myocardial infarction, a heart attack caused by a blockage in the coronary arteries feeding his heart muscle. In previous administrations, such a crisis might have been wrapped in euphemism or hidden altogether. With Eisenhower, the calculus shifted. For hours, the White House wrestled with how much to say, but as word leaked and markets trembled, they moved toward unprecedented transparency. Detailed medical bulletins were issued. Cardiologist Paul Dudley White, brought in as a consultant, briefed the press, explaining coronary thrombosis and recovery prospects in plain language. Americans read front-page updates about their president's pulse rate, diet, bowel movements, and physical therapy regimen. Newspapers printed diagrams of the heart. The idea that the public had a right to understand the commander-in-chief's health, not just his policies, took root in a new way. Eisenhower spent weeks in the hospital, then months recuperating, his schedule adjusted to accommodate rest and monitored exercise. Remarkably, he returned to office, won re-election in 1956, and served out his term, but the shadow of the heart attack never entirely lifted. Future candidates and presidents would be asked, sometimes aggressively, about their cardiac risk, their blood pressure, their medical histories. Eisenhower's 1955 infarction thus became more than a personal medical drama. It marked a turning point in the informal contract between presidents and the people they serve, a moment when the workings of a single coronary artery forced the institution of the presidency to become at least somewhat more anatomically honest. Number 55. Dwight D. Eisenhower's ilitis surgery and the fear of an empty Oval Office. Less than a year after reassuring Americans that his heart had recovered enough for him to seek a second term, Eisenhower's body delivered another reminder that the presidency sits on mortal flesh. In June 1956, while at his Gettysburg farm, he developed sudden, gripping pain low in his abdomen, the kind that makes even a former Supreme Allied commander curl in on himself and go pale. The initial suspicion was indigestion or maybe a minor intestinal upset. As hours passed, the pain intensified, his abdomen grew tender, and his doctors began to fear something more ominous, a blockage or inflammation in the terminal ileum, the final stretch of small intestine. In the era before CT scans, diagnosis relied on examination, x-rays, and a clinical hunch. The conclusion was that he needed surgery, soon. The word ileitis appeared in the first bulletins, a somewhat vague term covering inflammation, possible obstruction, and the specter of perforation, which can rapidly become life-threatening. For the second time in less than a year, the country watched hospitals and operating rooms inch their way into the center of national security. The operation removed a segment of diseased intestine. Reports emphasized that no cancer was found, a detail meant to calm investors and voters as much as family. Yet behind the carefully worded updates, constitutional questions sharpened. What if he took a bad turn under anesthesia? What if an infection set in and lingered? The 25th Amendment, with its formal procedures for transferring power in cases of incapacity, did not yet exist. Instead, informal letters were drafted, contingency plans whispered among advisors, and Vice President Richard Nixon once again loitered near the edge of authority, ready but not quite authorized. Eisenhower recovered, thin and subdued, then campaigned anyway, his surgical scar hidden under tailored suits, while speeches framed him as stable, steady, experienced. The ileitis episode underscored how fragile presidential continuity could be, hanging at times on loops of inflamed bowel and the skill of a surgeon's hand. Number 56. Dwight D. Eisenhower's 1957 stroke and the worry about a mind clouded in midterm. If a heart attack threatened Eisenhower's life and intestinal surgery threatened his physical resilience, the event that most unnerved observers came in November 1957, when the question shifted from "can he survive?" to "can he think clearly?" One evening, while working, the president suddenly found his speech slipping away. The words were there in his mind, but when he tried to speak them, they emerged halting, distorted, or not at all. His right hand felt clumsy. Doctors were summoned. Neurological exams performed at his bedside. The diagnosis was a mild cerebral thrombosis, what we would now call a small stroke, likely a clot in a vessel feeding a language center of his brain. In public, the official line stressed its little nature, a transient disturbance with no significant residual effect. In private, the implications were chilling. A stroke does not simply weaken muscles. It can alter judgment, memory, processing speed. The invisible circuitry a president relies on to weigh missile deployments and budget lines. Eisenhower's doctors watched closely for signs of cognitive decline, testing reflexes, tracking his ability to follow complex questions, reassuring themselves and the cabinet that his intellect remained intact. The press, now accustomed to receiving medical briefings after his earlier crises, pushed for details. Could he still read dense reports? Was his decision-making affected? Markets fluttered again. Foreign leaders sniffed for weakness. Eisenhower, who prided himself on composure, made a point of meeting reporters, answering questions, projecting calm competence. The subtlety of brain injury, however, made full transparency impossible. There is no lab test that definitively certifies presidential judgment normal. The episode intensified debates that had been simmering since his heart attack. Should there be a clear mechanism for temporarily transferring power when a president is anesthetized, or when his brain has taken a vascular hit? Lawyers and legislators began sketching proposals that would eventually harden into the 25th Amendment after another, later crisis. In that sense, Eisenhower's mild stroke did more than briefly tangle his words. It helped push the United States toward finally acknowledging that the health of the commander-in-chief's brain is a matter of public structure, not just private medicine. Number 57. John F. Kennedy's Addison's disease and the carefully managed secret of a fragile endocrine system. When John F. Kennedy campaigned in 1960, the image was youth itself, tanned, athletic, energetic, sailing off Hyannisport with the wind in his hair and a football tucked under his arm. The reality tucked inside his medical charts was much more precarious. For years, Kennedy had been treated for Addison's disease, a chronic failure of the adrenal cortex that, left unmanaged, can cause profound fatigue, low blood pressure, weight loss, and life-threatening crises under stress. In Kennedy's case, the adrenal glands perched atop his kidneys were no longer adequately pumping out cortisol and aldosterone, hormones that help the body navigate everything from infection to emotional strain. In the 1930s and 40s, when his symptoms first emerged, tan skin, weakness, salt cravings, dizzy spells, Addison's was often a death sentence. By the time he ran for president, synthetic steroids had transformed prognosis, turning a fatal illness into a demanding but manageable chronic condition. Manageable, that is, if doses are carefully calibrated and stressors anticipated. Kennedy's regimen involved daily corticosteroids and mineralocorticoids, with emergency injections ready in case of adrenal crisis. His doctors monitored blood pressure, weight, and electrolytes. Adjustments were frequent, particularly in times of travel, infection, or major political tension. Publicly, the campaign brushed off questions about his health as exaggerated or malicious, sometimes describing earlier episodes as temporary fatigue or a back problem without mentioning the endocrine engine underneath. Concerned journalists and political opponents occasionally raised the term Addison's, but were met with vigorous denials or hedged language. His condition was under control, mild, no longer active. Later analyses of his medical records suggest a more complicated picture, with genuine physiological vulnerability masked by skilled management and artful phrasing. The irony is that modern medicine had made it entirely possible for someone with Addison's disease to function, even flourish in high office, provided safeguards were in place. But in the political climate of the Cold War, acknowledging that the nuclear button rested under the finger of a man whose body could not manufacture its own stress hormones felt too risky. So the American public met the bronzed, smiling Kennedy and never quite saw the fragile endocrine scaffolding that had to hold every time the world moved a little closer to midnight. Number 58. John F. Kennedy's chronic back pain, and the presidency conducted from a cushioned chair. Long before the Oval Office, John Kennedy's spine had been a battleground. As a young man, he suffered repeated bouts of severe low back pain, the kind that pins a person to bed, radiates down into the legs, and refuses to fully let go. World War II service in the Pacific, including the PT-109 incident in which he helped crewmen to safety, added trauma to an already vulnerable back. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, X-rays showed degeneration in his lumbar spine, Surgeons fused vertebrae, inserted hardware, tried experimental operations that today would be approached with more caution. Some procedures left him temporarily in worse shape, with infection and scarring complicating an already unhappy column of bone and nerve. Pain became his constant, unwelcome companion. As President Kennedy's public image remained vigorous, touch football, brisk walks, a rocking chair as a charming prop, but daily life was carefully engineered around his back. He wore a stiff brace that encased his torso, forcing him to sit straighter than comfort allowed and limiting the motion that might otherwise trigger spasms. He used a specially designed rocking chair in the Oval Office, not as a quaint affectation, but as a way to keep his spine gently moving, easing pressure on joints and discs. Meetings were often kept shorter than staffers might have liked, not only because of politics but because sitting too long was torture. At times he needed help simply to get out of bed or into a car, those transitions where pain can spike from tolerable to blinding. The back problems intersected uneasily with his other conditions. Steroids for Addison's could weaken bone, while some surgeries and infections demanded even more steroid support, trapping him in a loop of cause and effect. Security considerations also threaded through decisions. A rigid brace might stabilize his spine, but also limit his ability to duck or move quickly in a crisis. Pain medications could dull suffering, but also potentially cloud reaction times in a nuclear standoff. Kennedy, his doctors, and his aides constantly calibrated the trade-offs, trying to keep him upright, functional, and sharp enough to face Khrushchev one day and domestic crises the next. All while the American public saw only the confident stride and the easy smile, not the man who sometimes needed to brace himself against a desk before standing. Number 59. John F. Kennedy's heavy medication regimen and the quiet pharmacy that traveled with him. The list of medications John F. Kennedy took while in the White House reads less like a simple prescription and more like a small pharmacopoeia. To manage Addison's disease, he received daily corticosteroids and mineralocorticoids. For his back pain and muscle spasms, he used a combination of narcotic analgesics, non-opioid painkillers, and muscle relaxants. Chronic gastrointestinal issues, possibly related to both stress and the effects of his other drugs, brought antispasmodics and antidiarrheals into the mix. Allergies and sinus problems added antihistamines. Episodes of low mood and fatigue prompted some doctors to experiment with amphetamine-based stimulants or mood-elevating compounds that would today be classified and regulated very differently. Vitamin injections, including B12, became part of a routine meant to bolster energy. Over the years, different physicians cycled in and out of his care, each bringing their own favorite therapies. Some accounts describe a Dr. Feelgood figure providing injections that Jack Kennedy reportedly said made him feel 10 years younger before important events. Others emphasize the more conservative, cautious practitioners trying to impose order on an already complex regimen. The result was a president whose day sometimes began not just with a briefing book, but with a sequence of pills and shots designed to keep his physiology within a workable range. In the 1960 campaign, his team minimized talk of chronic illness, characterizing questions about medication use as politically motivated smears. Later, when fragments of his medical history emerged, commentators debated whether the cocktail he took could have meaningfully affected his judgment, mood, or risk tolerance during crises like the Bay of Pigs or the Cuban Missile Crisis. The historical record offers no simple answer. Human response to such combinations is highly individual, and Kennedy's advisors generally described him as sharp, engaged, and deliberative at key moments. What is clear is that the idea of a young, vigorous president rested on a scaffolding of modern pharmacology. The Cold War White House functioned in part as a moving clinic, with vials and syringes tucked into briefcases alongside classified documents, a reminder that the image of effortless vitality often floats atop a layered, medically engineered reality. Number 60. Lyndon B. Johnson's first major heart attack and the warning shot before the Great Society. Long before he took the oath of office on Air Force One, Lyndon Johnson's chest had already declared its own emergency. In July 1955, while serving as Senate Majority Leader, Johnson was at his Texas ranch when he experienced crushing chest pain, shortness of breath, and a sense of impending doom, classic hallmarks of a significant heart attack. The ranch, with its cigars, Hearty meals and relentless political phone calls suddenly became the backdrop for frantic medical improvisation. Doctors arrived, confirmed myocardial infarction, and imposed bed rest that for Johnson felt like a prison sentence. He had been a man of perpetual motion, working 18-hour days, bullying legislation through committees, pacing and cajoling. Now, even sitting up too quickly could send his heart racing. The official bulletins at the time did acknowledge a heart attack, but softened its severity, emphasizing good spirits and steady recovery. Behind the scenes, physicians quietly warned him that another infarction could be fatal, that his arteries were diseased, that he needed to lose weight, stop smoking, slow down. Johnson, ever the political animal, both listened and rebelled. He made some changes, then slid back toward old habits, a push and pull that would define much of his later health behavior. When fate propelled him into the presidency after Kennedy's assassination, this cardiac history came with him, an invisible rider on the great legislative ambitions he unleashed. The Great Society, the Civil Rights Act, Medicare, these all unfolded under a man whose coronary arteries had already once tried to shut down his body's central engine. Advisors occasionally worried. Could stress from Vietnam, domestic unrest, and constant political combat trigger another perhaps final myocardial event? Johnson's own awareness of his vulnerability colored his decisions about re-election in 1968. He spoke openly in private about not wanting to die in office, about the toll the job took on his health. His first heart attack, then, was more than an isolated medical event. It was an early, stark reminder that the American political system routinely leans on men whose bodies are already carrying red flag diagnoses, building empires of policy on hearts that have already once dramatically failed. Number 61. Lyndon B. Johnson's gallbladder and kidney stone surgery, and the televised reminder that presidents have organs too. If Johnson's 1955 heart attack foreshadowed the cardiac risks shadowing his presidency, the surgery he underwent in October 1965 dragged his internal anatomy right into the public square. After months of intermittent abdominal pain and digestive distress, doctors identified a diseased gallbladder and troublesome kidney stones that needed to come out. For a sitting president barely 2 years removed from Dallas, anything involving general anesthesia sparked immediate worry. Johnson, ever conscious of image but also oddly fascinated with his own body, agreed to an unusually high level of public disclosure. Medical bulletins described not just minor discomfort, but the removal of the entire gallbladder and stones from his urinary tract. Photographs of his postoperative scar, stretching along his abdomen, were taken and circulated, partly at his own insistence, as if to prove he had nothing to hide. The country watched as the White House announced temporary transfers of routine duties, but no formal handoff of power. The 25th Amendment was not yet fully ratified, and the Constitution offered only vague guidance on what to do if a president was unconscious on an operating table. For several hours, the commander-in-chief lay intubated and insensate, while Vietnam escalated and civil rights battles simmered. Behind the scenes, aides prepared contingency plans should complications arise: infections, hemorrhage, cardiac arrhythmia triggered by stress on his compromised heart. Johnson recovered, complaining loudly about hospital food and boring rooms, but the episode left an imprint. Americans had now seen X-ray diagrams of a president's gallstones on the evening news. The mystical distance surrounding the office thinned a little, replaced by the image of a bulky Texan in a hospital gown, stitched up and reminded that even the most powerful man in the world can be felled by a tiny stone lodged in a duct. Number 62. Lyndon B. Johnson's skin cancer scare, and the anxiety of a man who examined every mole. Johnson's body was a map of medical stories, and by the mid-1960s, he had begun to fixate on its surface as much as its arteries. Years of Texas sun, outdoor campaigning, and a fondness for going shirtless around the ranch had left his skin mottled, freckled, and peppered with suspicious spots. In 1966, doctors removed a basal cell lesion from his face, a common, typically non-metastatic form of skin cancer, but the word cancer attached to a president's chart is never treated as common. Official statements downplayed it as a routine excision, reassuring the public that there was no threat to his overall health, but inside the White House it fed Johnson's already simmering health anxiety. He peppered physicians with questions about every new mark, demanded biopsies for bumps that most patients would ignore, and fretted about whether this or that growth meant something big was coming. The political climate made candor complicated. Nuclear standoffs and domestic upheaval did not pair well with admissions that the president was worrying about malignancy on his own nose. At the same time, the earlier transparency around his gallbladder had created an expectation of more detailed medical disclosure. So the basal cell removal occupied an odd middle ground, acknowledged but minimized, medically real yet politically trivialized. Dermatologists quietly scheduled regular checks, knowing that cumulative sun damage could yield further lesions, while Johnson oscillated between dismissive bravado and late-night dread over what his own cells might be doing without his permission. In the end, the basal cell scare underscored a theme running through his later years: a man trying to micromanage a war, a Congress, and even his own epidermis, discovering that control is more illusion than reality. Number 63. Richard Nixon's phlebitis and the swollen leg that landed a president in the hospital. When people think of Nixon in crisis, they picture taping systems, missing minutes, and courtroom dramas, not the throbbing ache of an inflamed vein. Yet in September 1974, barely a month after resigning the presidency, Nixon's body staged its own reckoning in the form of severe phlebitis, an inflammation of the veins in his left leg, complicated by blood clots. The condition had flickered before during his time in office, but stress, travel, and long hours sitting at desks and on planes had set the stage for something more dangerous. Now, as Watergate's legal aftermath closed in, his leg grew hot, red, and exquisitely painful. Doctors worried that clots could dislodge and travel to his lungs in a potentially fatal pulmonary embolism, insisted on hospitalization and surgery to remove the offending thrombi. For a former president under investigation, the optics were inseparable from the medical reality. Stories circulated about whether his condition might delay grand jury appearances or complicate decisions about potential prosecution. Some critics muttered that the phlebitis was exaggerated to evoke sympathy. Surgeons pointed to the actual incisions and pathology reports as evidence that the threat had been very real. In purely physiological terms, phlebitis in a man of Nixon's age and stress level was no surprise. Repeated flights, high blood pressure, and chains of tense, seated hours create perfect conditions for venous trouble. But wrapped around that medical narrative was another. A leader whose political circulation had already clotted now found his own veins betraying him, turning every step into a reminder that even in retirement, the body keeps its own ledger of past strain. Number 64. Richard Nixon's pneumonia and the breathless weakness behind a presidency under siege. Long before the leg pain of phlebitis, Nixon's lungs had already signaled their vulnerability. In early 1974, as the Watergate scandal escalated, he developed a serious bout of pneumonia that left him feverish, short of breath, and uncharacteristically fragile. Official communiques at the time framed it as a respiratory infection requiring rest at the presidential retreat, the sort of winter ailment any middle-aged man might endure, but the timing raised unavoidable questions. Subpoenas were flying, impeachment talk had moved from fringe to mainstream, and suddenly the man at the center of it all was too ill to appear in public for stretches of time. Doctors examining him saw crackling lungs on auscultation and X-ray shadows compatible with bacterial pneumonia, an illness that, in someone under relentless stress and likely sleep-deprived, could tip from inconvenient to life-threatening. Antibiotics and oxygen helped, but recovery was slow, fatigue lingered, appetite waned, concentration ebbed. Advisors debated how much to disclose. Too much detail about a weakened president could embolden opponents at home and abroad. Too little would feed suspicion that illness was being used as a shield from accountability. In the end, the pneumonia became one more layer in an already convoluted narrative: legal crisis, political crisis, and now a biological one that left the most powerful man in the country catching his breath between coughs. The episode illustrated how respiratory infections, which rarely make it into history books, can nonetheless shape the tempo of events, delaying meetings, altering travel, and shading the demeanor of a leader already walking a tightrope. Number 65. Gerald Ford's arthritis and the quiet stiffness behind the former athlete's easy smile. Gerald Ford entered the national stage with a reputation for physical vigor, a star football player at the University of Michigan, a man who prided himself on staying trim and active long past his collegiate glory days. By the time he occupied the Oval Office in the mid-1970s, however, That athletic history had left its mark in the form of gradual, grinding arthritis. Joints that once absorbed tackles and sprints now protested climbing stairs and standing through ceremonies. Ford's public persona, cheerful, steady, fit, masked the reality that he often woke with stiffness in his knees, hips, and lower back, needing time to loosen up before any day of meetings or travel. Occasional stumbles, famously caricatured by comedians as clumsiness, were in part the natural result of an aging body negotiating slick steps and awkward handshakes under the eyes of cameras. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, heat, and stretching became quiet parts of his daily routine, as did consultations with physicians about how to maintain mobility without courting ulcers or other side effects. In an era before presidential fitness routines were curated on social media, these accommodations remained largely invisible. Ford's arthritis never rose to the level of constitutional crisis, yet it shaped his comfort during flights, his tolerance for long-standing receptions, and his energy at the end of days filled with pardons, inflation battles, and Cold War diplomacy. The former linebacker discovered, as so many aging athletes do, that the bill for youthful invincibility often arrives decades later, payable in creaks and aches that no amount of good-natured optimism can entirely erase. Number 66. Jimmy Carter's hemorrhoids and the unusually frank campaign. Talk about a painful, embarrassing ailment. By the time Jimmy Carter ran for president in 1976, Americans had lived through assassinations, Vietnam, Watergate, and a string of opaque medical bulletins about their leader's health. Carter, a peanut farmer and engineer from Georgia, offered something different, an almost disarming candor that extended even to the most undignified corners of human anatomy. When it emerged that he had undergone surgery for hemorrhoids, swollen, painful veins in the rectal area that can bleed and throb with every movement, he did not dodge the subject or wrap it in euphemism. Instead, he acknowledged it openly, folding it into a broader theme of transparency about his medical history. For many politicians, admitting to a condition associated with bathroom jokes and whispered complaints would have been unthinkable. Presidents were supposed to have hearts and lungs, not hemorrhoids. Carter's willingness to discuss it signaled a subtle shift. If voters were being asked to trust him after years of secrecy and scandal, he seemed determined to show he had little interest in hiding even the awkward facts. Medically, the surgery was minor compared to heart attacks or strokes, but anyone who has endured hemorrhoid pain knows it can be intensely disruptive, making sitting through long meetings or endless campaign flights a test of endurance. Carter's recovery involved the same realities facing any patient: discomfort, dietary adjustments, careful management of strain. The symbolic dimension, however, mattered more. In an arena where presidential bodies had long been treated as quasi-sacred mysteries, Carter's hemorrhoid disclosure suggested that the person behind the podium was, quite literally, as human as everyone else. Number 67. Ronald Reagan's colon cancer surgery and the first real-world test of presidential power transfer. When surgeons opened Ronald Reagan's abdomen in July 1985 to remove a cancerous polyp from his colon, they weren't just cutting into a 74-year-old man. They were probing the soft underbelly of the Constitution. The 25th Amendment had been ratified for years, but no president had yet formally invoked its provisions to hand power to the vice president during a planned medical procedure. Reagan's doctors warned that general anesthesia could last hours, that complications like bleeding or additional tumors were possible, and that an elderly patient might awaken confused or not at all. Behind the public statements about a routine operation, lawyers drafted letters transferring authority to Vice President George H. W. Bush, wording them carefully to suggest a temporary arrangement rather than a precedent-setting admission of disability. For roughly 8 hours, while surgeons removed a segment of colon and checked lymph nodes for spread, Nuclear Launch Authority effectively rested with a man who had not been elected president. Reagan later joked about losing a little hardware, but insisted he had never truly given up power, even as the documents and timelines told a more complicated story. The pathology report showed an early-stage carcinoma, surgically curable but symbolically potent. Americans got their first glimpse of what it meant when a president's bowel, rather than his policy, dictated who was in charge, and future administrations quietly studied the episode as a template for handling everything from colonoscopies to cardiac procedures. Number 68. Ronald Reagan's gunshot recovery and the lung that came within an inch of ending a presidency. On March 30, 1981, outside the Washington Hilton, a single bullet dramatically redefined the Reagan administration's first year. John Hinckley Jr.'s .22 caliber round ricocheted off the presidential limousine and entered Reagan's left side, shattering a rib, puncturing a lung, and stopping less than an inch from his heart. At first, aides thought he was merely bruised, helping him into the car as he joked weakly, until frothy, blood-tinged breath and collapsing blood pressure made it clear something far worse was happening. In the emergency room, the Secret Service debated whether to declare a national security crisis, while surgeons inserted chest tubes, suctioning out blood and air so the lung could re-expand. The public narrative emphasized Reagan's quips, telling his wife, "Honey, I forgot to duck," reassuring doctors he hoped they were Republicans, but the postoperative reality included pain that made every breath a negotiation, risk of pneumonia in an elderly patient, and the ever-present danger of a lethal arrhythmia triggered by trauma and anesthesia. For days, the country existed in a strange limbo, the president technically in command but physically tethered to monitors, his heartbeat and oxygenation becoming matters of state. The nearly fatal proximity of the bullet to his heart was downplayed at first, only later acknowledged as the razor-thin line between an inspiring survival story and an abrupt transfer of power early in his presidency. Number 69. Ronald Reagan's hearing loss and the quiet cost of decades around guns and stage noise. Reagan's on-screen image and later political persona leaned heavily on the confident, unflappable communicator, but by the time he reached the White House, one ear in particular had long since betrayed him. Years of firing blank-loaded pistols on movie sets, where hearing protection was an afterthought, combined with military training noise and campaign rallies to inflict cumulative damage on the delicate hair cells inside his inner ears. In the 1930s, a miscalculated blank discharge reportedly went off close to his right ear, leaving him with noticeable high-frequency hearing loss on that side. Over the decades, he adapted like many aging men do, nodding through muffled sentences, relying on context, positioning himself strategically in conversations until hearing aids became unavoidable. When he finally began wearing them publicly in the early 1980s, manufacturers celebrated the presidential endorsement, but the devices also signaled something more human. The so-called great communicator sometimes struggled simply to hear the words spoken back to him. In cabinet meetings and diplomatic sessions, staff learned to speak clearly and project, knowing that misheard phrases at that level could, in theory, have consequences. The hearing impairment never rose to the level of crisis, yet it quietly shaped his daily interactions, underscoring how a lifetime spent projecting his voice had, ironically, dulled his ability to fully receive what others were saying. Number 70, George H.W. Bush's Graves' disease and the strange coincidence of a presidential couple with this same autoimmune disorder. In 1991, amid the aftermath of the Gulf War and grinding domestic debates, George H.W. Bush began to tremble, his hands shook, his heart raced, pounds seemed to melt away, and his usual patrician composure gave way at times to visible fatigue and jitteriness. Doctors eventually diagnosed Graves' disease, an autoimmune condition in which the immune system mistakenly attacks the thyroid, pushing it into overdrive and flooding the body with thyroid hormone. The thyroid swelled, his metabolism accelerated, and his cardiovascular system bore the brunt. Palpitations, sweat-damp shirts under suits, and an uneasy awareness that an overactive thyroid in a man his age can tip into heart rhythm disturbances or even heart failure. Treatment with antithyroid drugs and radioactive iodine aimed to quiet the gland before it did lasting damage. Then came an uncanny twist. Barbara Bush was diagnosed with Graves' disease around the same period, prompting speculation about shared environmental triggers in the vice presidential residence or the White House. Experts debated whether it was mere coincidence or a hint at something in their surroundings. No firm culprit was identified. Publicly, Bush brushed it off as a manageable annoyance, but behind the scenes, endocrinologists tracked his hormone levels closely, aware that the engine of the presidency now ran atop a gland his own immune cells were trying to burn out. Number 71. George H.W. Bush's cardiac arrhythmia and the heart that occasionally refused to keep a steady beat. Long before his dramatic skydiving stunts in old age, George H.W. Bush had a more subtle flirtation with cardiac danger, episodes of atrial fibrillation, an irregular heartbeat in which the upper chambers of the heart quiver instead of contracting efficiently. During his presidency, he experienced spells of lightheadedness and rapid, fluttering pulses that sent him to physicians for evaluation and monitoring. Atrial fibrillation in a man of his age and history, tall, lean, with underlying thyroid issues from Graves' disease, is a known complication, increasing the risk of blood clots that can travel to the brain and cause stroke. Bush underwent Holter monitoring, wore wires and portable devices that recorded every heartbeat over 24 hours, while cardiologists parsed the tracings for patterns. How long the arrhythmia lasted, how fast his ventricles responded, whether medication could tame the rhythm without sapping his energy. Antiarrhythmic drugs and blood thinners entered the quiet pharmacy list that never made it into campaign brochures. The episodes weren't constant, but each one was a reminder that the presidential schedule, early briefings, long flights, late-night calls, was being maintained by a pump with an occasional electrical stutter. In public, Bush projected calm New England steadiness. In private, doctors calculated stroke probabilities on chart paper, trying to keep the commander-in-chief's heart in line without drawing the world's attention to every skipped beat. Number 72. Bill Clinton's fast food presidency and the arteries that finally protested. Bill Clinton entered the White House as a baby boomer symbol of energy and charisma, jogging in public and talking policy between bites of burgers and fries. The cameras loved the running, his coronary arteries did not. Years of high-fat, high-cholesterol fast food, combined with a family history of heart disease and a stressful, often sedentary job, quietly layered plaque along the inner walls of his vessels. By the early 2000s, long after he'd left office, the bill came due. Clinton developed angina, chest discomfort and shortness of breath with exertion, signaling that blood flow to his heart muscle was compromised. In 2004, surgeons performed quadruple coronary artery bypass surgery, rerouting blood around critically narrowed segments that, left untreated, could have triggered a massive heart attack. The former president, who once embodied campaign trail vigor, now confronted the fragility of the very organ that powered his frenetic pace. Later, he publicly credited the scare with pushing him toward a more plant-based diet and lifestyle changes, but the episode underscored how presidential mythology about jogging and fitness can obscure more mundane realities. Late-night stress eating, limited sleep, and the slow, invisible construction of arterial time bombs. His heart disease was not a sudden bolt from the blue. It was the predictable, if delayed, consequence of choices made over decades, including those made in drive-through lanes with Secret Service cars idling behind him. Number 73. Bill Clinton's quadruple bypass surgery and the heart that finally forced a timeout. By the summer of 2004, Bill Clinton's carefully curated image as the jogging president crashed into the cold math of cardiology. Years of unchecked cholesterol, stress, and a family history written in clogged arteries converged into classic warning signs he tried to downplay. Tightness in his chest walking upstairs, shortness of breath that didn't match the effort, a fatigue he could no longer blame on speeches and travel. A stress test and angiogram stripped away all spin. Multiple major coronary arteries were severely narrowed, some more than 90% blocked, a map of near misses for a fatal heart attack. Cardiothoracic surgeons recommended emergency quadruple bypass, open heart surgery that would literally stop his heart, connect him to a heart-lung machine, and sew in grafts from his leg and chest to reroute blood around the obstructed segments. While the public statement framed it as precautionary, the operative report told another story. This wasn't elective tuning, it was crisis prevention. For hours, his chest lay open while surgeons threaded sutures through millimeter-wide vessels, every stitch a hedge against sudden death. When he awoke, groggy and wired to monitors, the man accustomed to relentless motion suddenly couldn't cough without pain or walk without help. The surgery worked, restoring blood flow, but it also exposed how thin the line had been between post-presidential activism and a headline about a former commander-in-chief felled by a massive myocardial infarction. Number 74. Bill Clinton's stent procedure and the reminder that bypass is not a cure. 6 years after his dramatic quadruple bypass, Clinton got another unwelcome reminder that heart disease isn't a one-time event you surgically erase. In 2010, he again developed chest discomfort, a familiar, unsettling echo of his pre-bypass symptoms. Tests showed that one of the grafted arteries from his earlier surgery had become significantly narrowed, choking off the carefully constructed detour surgeons had built around his original blockages. Cardiologists opted for a less invasive fix this time, percutaneous coronary intervention, threading catheters through his arteries to place tiny metal stents, mesh scaffolds designed to push the narrowing open and hold the vessel wide. Unlike bypass, there was no sawing through the breastbone, no heart-lung machine, but the stakes were still very real. A poorly placed stent, a clot forming on its surface, or a sudden closure could trigger the very heart attack the bypass had postponed. The procedure went smoothly, and the former president was discharged quickly, but the symbolism lingered. Even with world-class care, celebrity cardiologists, and every incentive to follow medical advice, his vascular system kept trying to close in on itself. The stents weren't a sign of failure so much as a quiet admission of reality. A presidency might last 8 years, but coronary artery disease is a chronic lifelong companion, demanding constant negotiation long after the motorcades are gone. Number 75. George W. Bush's colon polyps and the politics of preventive medicine. George W. Bush's medical file doesn't feature dramatic battlefield injuries or emergency surgeries, but it does contain a quieter, more universal threat: colon polyps. Twice during routine colonoscopies, once as president, doctors found and removed these small growths from the lining of his large intestine. Polyps are common, especially with age, and most are benign, but certain types can slowly transform into colorectal cancer over years if left in place. The procedure itself required something presidents rarely advertise: sedation, bowel prep, and a brief, formal transfer of power to the vice president while he was under anesthesia. Each time, the pathology reports came back without malignancy, a medical bullet dodged not through heroism but through scheduled screening. The White House used the episodes as teachable moments, emphasizing how colonoscopies save lives by catching precancerous lesions early. Behind the press releases, gastroenterologists reviewed his family history, calculated his future risk, and set follow-up intervals on a calendar that would outlast his term. In a way, Bush's polyps were the most democratic of presidential ailments, exactly the kind of problem millions of Americans face, and exactly the kind of disease that quietly kills when people skip the unglamorous appointments their doctors recommend. Number 76. George W. Bush's choking incident and the fragility of a solo snack in the seat of power. On a January evening in 2002, George W. Bush discovered how quickly the mundane can turn medical when you're president. Watching football in the White House residence, he popped a pretzel into his mouth, choked, and briefly lost consciousness. The Heimlich maneuver wasn't what saved him. Instead, the combination of gag reflex and sudden drop in heart rate, likely a vagal response, caused him to faint, fall forward, and hit his face on the floor, loosening the obstruction. When the Secret Service rushed in, they found the leader of the free world with a bruised cheek and a split lip. The official explanation later boiled down to "I fainted after choking on a pretzel." It sounded almost comical, late-night talk show fodder, but the physiology underneath was serious. A sudden loss of airway can kill in minutes, and a hard fall for a man in his 50s can mean concussion or worse. Doctors checked for arrhythmias, monitored his vital signs, and reassured a global audience that a snack food had not in fact derailed American governance. The incident underscored something rarely acknowledged in national security briefings. Sometimes the greatest immediate risk to a president is not an assassin or a foreign adversary, but a poorly chewed bite of food and a moment of inattention in a quiet room. Number 77. Barack Obama's smoking struggle and the addiction he tried to bury beneath clean-cut rhetoric. Barack Obama spent much of his political rise talking about responsibility, healthcare, and personal discipline while privately fighting a very human battle with nicotine. He started smoking as a young man, decades before the White House, and like many long-term smokers, he didn't simply flip a switch and stop when the cameras showed up. During his first presidential campaign, and into his early years in office, he relied on nicotine gum, mints, and the occasional secret cigarette, trying to reconcile his public image with a habit he knew was both dangerous and politically awkward. Staffers and journalists occasionally caught whiffs of the struggle, jokes about quitting with varying degrees of success, anecdotal reports of stress-induced relapses during crises like the Affordable Care Act debates. His doctors monitored his blood pressure, cholesterol, and lung function, aware that long-term smoking raises the risk of heart disease, stroke, and cancer even in relatively young fit men. The official line eventually became that he had quit, largely thanks to his wife's pressure and nicotine replacement, but the timeline was fuzzy by design. In a presidency obsessed with messaging, his tobacco dependence was a reminder that even the most disciplined leaders wrestle with cravings at odds with their own stated values, and that addiction doesn't care whether your office has an oval. Number 78. Barack Obama's acid reflux and the sore throat that prompted a quiet cancer scare. Late in his second term, Barack Obama developed a persistent sore throat that refused to respect schedules or speeches. It lingered long enough that his physicians, guided by the rule that anything unusual in a president warrants over caution, ordered an evaluation at Walter Reed. An ear, nose, and throat specialist performed a fiber optic exam, threading a tiny camera through his nose to look at the back of his throat and larynx, searching for signs of tumors, infection, or structural abnormalities. For a man who relied on his voice as his primary political instrument, the unspoken fear was obvious: throat or laryngeal cancer, especially given his history of smoking. Instead, imaging and examination pointed to something far more common and less sinister: acid reflux, in which stomach acid chronically splashes up into the esophagus and throat, causing irritation, cough, and hoarseness. The prescription was almost disappointingly ordinary: dietary changes, avoiding late-night meals and certain trigger foods, elevating the head of the bed, and possibly medication to reduce stomach acid. Public statements framed it as a minor issue, but the episode revealed how even a routine diagnosis in a president passes through a filter of worst-case scenarios first. Behind the calm briefings, there had been a brief, very human window where the commander-in-chief's lingering sore throat was treated as a potential sign that the voice of the presidency itself might be under threat. Number 79. Donald Trump's COVID-19 hospitalization and the experimental cocktail that wasn't exactly standard issue. In October 2020, the sitting president, who had publicly downplayed COVID-19, suddenly became its most high-profile American patient. After days of reported fatigue, fever, and falling oxygen levels, Donald Trump was flown to Walter Reed, and the medical arsenal that emerged was not what an average 50-something with a new infection received at the time. Doctors gave him remdesivir, the antiviral still under emergency use, dexamethasone, a steroid usually reserved for patients with more advanced or severe disease, and an experimental monoclonal antibody cocktail from Regeneron that was then available only through clinical trials or special compassionate use channels. Public briefings described his course as mild, while simultaneously listing therapies associated with higher risk or worsening cases, a mismatch that left outside physicians parsing every lab number and offhand comment. His doctors alternated between reassurance and guarded language about transient drops in oxygen, hinting at a more complicated clinical picture than the optimistic soundbite suggested. Within days, he was back at the White House declaring himself recovered. But for many observers, the episode highlighted how the presidency bends the usual rules of triage: cutting-edge treatments, aggressive early intervention, and an information fog where the line between precaution and crisis is never fully clarified. Number 80. Donald Trump's weight, cholesterol, and the cardiac math behind the very stable genius. During his presidency, Donald Trump's annual physicals became minor media events, in part because they touched on something universally relatable and politically sensitive: weight and heart health. Official reports listed him just under the obesity cutoff one year and over it the next, with body mass index calculations placing him squarely in the obese range for a man of his height. His doctors touted excellent cardiac function while also prescribing a statin to lower elevated LDL cholesterol and emphasizing efforts to keep blood pressure in check, an implicit acknowledgement of classic cardiovascular risk factors: age, weight, lipid levels stacking up in a man in his 70s. The White House physician mentioned a coronary calcium score that, while not catastrophic, suggested plaque buildup in his arteries, the slow-motion process underlying many heart attacks. Public statements leaned hard on words like robust and no concerns, but cardiologists outside government quietly pointed out that a sedentary lifestyle, fast food-heavy diet, and obesity place anyone, president or not, on a statistical curve where coronary events become more likely. In the end, the medical summaries walked a careful line, technically reassuring while still nodding to numbers that would earn any other patient a firm lecture about diet, exercise, and long-term cardiac risk. Number 81. Joe Biden's brain aneurysm surgeries, and the president who once lay on an operating table between life and death. Long before Joe Biden became the oldest man ever sworn into the presidency, he had already stared down a kind of medical crisis that kills without warning. In 1988, while serving in the Senate, he developed a sudden, brutal headache that doctors eventually traced to a leaking intracranial aneurysm, a ballooned, weakened blood vessel in his brain at risk of rupturing catastrophically. Neurosurgeons performed an emergency operation, clamping off the aneurysm and temporarily stopping blood flow to parts of his brain. A high-stakes procedure where a slip of millimeters can mean paralysis, speech loss, or death. During his recovery, a second aneurysm on the other side was discovered and repaired in a separate surgery, doubling the risk and the rehab. He spent months relearning to speak at length without fatigue, monitoring for any sign of stroke or neurological deficit, while surgeons and neurologists watched scans for postoperative swelling or new weak spots in the arteries. The operations were painful, humbling, and, by his own account, life-reframing, forcing a man defined by constant motion to confront the fragility of the blood vessels inside his skull. By the time he reached the Oval Office decades later, imaging and follow-up exams suggested the repairs had held, but the story of a president with 2 clipped brain aneurysms underscored how close he once came to never making it past the Senate floor. Number 82. Joe Biden's atrial fibrillation history and the quiet drumbeat of an irregular presidential heart. In the list of Joe Biden's medical issues, one line that has drawn particular scrutiny is a history of atrial fibrillation, a common heart rhythm disturbance where the upper chambers of the heart quiver instead of beating in a coordinated way. Years before his presidency, he had episodes significant enough to be recorded and later described in medical summaries as non-valvular and no longer active, the kind that can be controlled or suppressed with medication and careful monitoring. Atrial fibrillation itself isn't usually fatal in the moment, but it raises the risk of blood clots forming in the heart and traveling to the brain, causing strokes, an especially worrying prospect in an older patient with a demanding job. White House physicians have emphasized that his rhythm has remained stable, that he's on preventive therapies, and that echocardiograms and stress tests show preserved function. Still, every physical report includes some reference to ongoing surveillance of his cardiovascular system, a reminder that even resolved arrhythmias are watched like a bad character who might someday come back. For the public, the phrase history of atrial fibrillation may sound technical. For cardiologists, it's a quiet flag that the president's heartbeat has, at times, needed a closer eye. Number 83. James A. Garfield's wasting body and the 1970 medicine that helped kill him. When President James A. Garfield was shot in July 1881, the bullet did not kill him immediately. 19th century medicine slowly finished the job. Modern analysis suggests the wound, while serious, might have been survivable with sterile technique and imaging, but his doctors repeatedly probed the track with unwashed fingers and instruments, introducing infection as they hunted for the projectile they never actually located. Garfield spent nearly 80 days in bed, feverish and increasingly emaciated, as abscesses formed deep in his body and pus tracked along tissues his physicians didn't understand. His weight plummeted from around 200 pounds to barely more than 100, his body consuming its own muscle while attendants tried to force in calories via rectal and nasogastric feeding, crude methods that often failed to deliver real nutrition. Accounts from the time describe bed sores, relentless pain, and a once vigorous man reduced to a skeletal figure, his heart straining to keep up with constant infection and dehydration. The public heard upbeat bulletins about resting comfortably, while behind the scenes his pulse ran high, his temperature spiked, and his body shrank daily. In the end, sepsis and possibly a ruptured splenic artery ended his life, but the drawn-out wasting reflected something larger. A presidency undone not just by an assassin's bullet, but by an era's ignorance about germs, nutrition, and the basic mechanics of keeping a wounded man alive. Number 84. Grover Cleveland's secret jaw surgery and the carefully managed lie during a financial panic. In the summer of 1893, as the nation teetered on the edge of economic crisis, President Grover Cleveland quietly faced a very personal emergency growing inside his mouth. Dentists had found a suspicious lesion on the roof of his mouth that surgeons feared was a malignant cancer of the jaw, a diagnosis that, if public, could rattle already fragile markets and raise questions about his ability to govern. Cleveland and his advisors decided on a solution as audacious as it was deceptive. He would board a friend's yacht for a vacation cruise, and on that boat, a team of surgeons would remove part of his upper jaw and palate under ether, working in near secrecy while the vessel drifted along the east coast. Through a small incision inside his cheek, they extracted teeth, bone, and tumor, then later fitted a rubber prosthesis so his speech would sound normal. The White House told reporters he'd had 2 bad teeth pulled, a bland explanation repeated even as he returned looking thinner, speaking slightly differently, and healing from one of the more radical head and neck surgeries of the era. For years, the full truth stayed buried, denied in official statements and memoirs, while the press dutifully relayed the cover story. Only decades later did detailed accounts confirm what had really happened. During a financial panic, a sitting president had major cancer surgery, and his staff deliberately massaged, minimized, and misdirected the narrative to keep the public calm and the markets from spooking. Number 85. Edith Wilson's gatekeeping after the stroke and the shadow presidency that was never on the ballot. When Woodrow Wilson suffered his massive stroke in October 1919, the official line was that the president merely needed rest, but behind the bedroom door of the White House a different reality took shape. Partially paralyzed, with impaired vision and limited ability to concentrate, Wilson could not meet freely with cabinet members or lawmakers, so his wife Edith became the self-described steward of the presidency. She screened every document, decided which memos he would see, and sometimes wrote responses based on her interpretation of his wishes, blurring the line between messenger and decision-maker. Access to the president was tightly controlled. Cabinet officers were turned away or fed carefully curated information, while the public was told he was improving. There was no constitutional mechanism for temporary transfer of power, no 25th Amendment, just a gatekeeper with extraordinary informal authority. Historians still debate whether Edith was effectively acting as president or merely protecting her husband's dignity. But for months, the country's chief executive was a man largely hidden from view, with his wife functioning as the filter through which the machinery of government had to pass. Number 86. Franklin Roosevelt's hidden wheelchair strategies and the carefully choreographed illusion of a standing president. Franklin D. Roosevelt's paralysis from polio meant he could not walk unaided, but most Americans of his era never saw him as a wheelchair user. Instead, they saw a president who appeared at podiums, gripped a lectern, or stood supported by a son or aide, the result of a highly deliberate choreography. He wore heavy steel leg braces locked at the knee, used a cane, and practiced a carefully rehearsed walk that was really a series of hip swings and upper body momentum executed over short distances with someone at his elbow. Photographers were instructed not to capture him being lifted or wheeled. Secret Service agents blocked obstructive angles. Press norms of deference did the rest. Radio helped complete the illusion. People heard the booming voice and filled in a physically dominant figure. The concealment wasn't absolute, but it was systematic enough that many contemporaries described him as lame or partially disabled, rather than completely unable to walk. His strategy reflected both personal pride and a political calculation that a nation in crisis might hesitate to trust a leader whose wheelchair was fully visible, so the disability was real, the accommodations elaborate, and the public image carefully edited. Number 87. John F. Kennedy's compression garments, rigid back brace, and the tragic physics of a supported spine. By the time John F. Kennedy rode through Dallas in November 1963, his youthful image concealed a body held together by medicine and machinery. Years of back surgeries, chronic pain, and Addison's disease meant he wore a tightly laced canvas corset and rigid back brace under his clothes, along with special undershirts and sometimes additional supports to keep his spine upright during long days. The brace helped him stand at podiums and endure motorcade routes without collapsing into pain, but it also restricted his ability to bend or slump. In the chaos of the assassination, witnesses and later analysts noted that after the first shot struck, Kennedy's torso remained unnaturally upright, possibly because the brace prevented him from crumpling forward into a position that might have changed subsequent bullet trajectories. Some physicians and historians have cautiously suggested that the very device that allowed him to function as president may have reduced his body's ability to absorb or evade further injury, though others argue the fatal head wound would have been unsurvivable regardless. What is clear is that the polished, relaxed posture so familiar in photographs was never effortless. It was the product of medical supports and sheer will wrapped around a chronically failing back. Number 88. Ronald Reagan's Alzheimer's retrospective debate and the temptation to read disease backward into history. When Ronald Reagan announced in 1994 that he had Alzheimer's disease, 5 years after leaving office, a wave of retrospective scrutiny washed over his presidency. Commentators re-examined moments of verbal fumbling, reliance on note cards, and occasional lapses in detail, asking whether these were early signs of cognitive decline or simply the normal aging of a man in his 70s, carrying a heavy workload. His White House physicians had repeatedly declared him fit during his terms, and no formal diagnosis of dementia appeared in contemporary records. Yet some former aides and biographers later described subtle changes in his focus and memory near the end of his second term. Neurologists caution that Alzheimer's can smolder for years before obvious symptoms, but they also warn against confidently diagnosing the past through news clips and anecdotes. Official reviews, including one by the Reagan Library's medical archivists, have generally concluded there is no clear evidence he was impaired while in office, though disagreement persists among scholars and critics. The result is a permanent gray zone, a beloved yet polarizing president whose later illness invites questions that medicine cannot answer with certainty, turning ordinary slips of speech into potential clues in a mystery without a definitive solution. Number 89. Donald Trump's sudden Walter Reed visit and the speculation vacuum that filled the empty waiting room. In November 2019, months before COVID and a year before his hospitalization, Donald Trump made an unannounced trip to Walter Reed that set off a flurry of questions. There was no standard advance notice, no clear explanation about routine scheduling, just a motorcade to the military hospital on a Saturday and a brief statement about portions of an annual physical being done early. The White House emphasized there was no chest pain, no emergency, no transfer of power to the vice president, but the lack of detailed information created a classic vacuum. Doctors on TV guessed at possible cardiac tests, social media rumors imagined mini-strokes or secret procedures, and press briefings stuck to vague reassurances. Later accounts from officials described it as a fast, opportunistic update to his exam, with labs and imaging done in a single batch, but they never fully addressed why the logistics diverged from his prior, more scripted physicals. Without comprehensive records released, the episode remains a small, unresolved chapter in presidential medical history, neither confirmed crisis nor clearly routine, just a reminder that when health information is sparse, imagination eagerly supplies the missing data. Number 90. Joe Biden's gait, stiffness, and the quiet orthopedic story behind an older president's walk. As Joe Biden entered the presidency in his late 70s, public attention focused not just on his words, but on how he moved. Viewers noticed a stiffer, shorter strided gait, occasional missteps on stairs, and a slightly forward-leaning posture that fueled armchair diagnoses ranging from Parkinson's disease to advancing dementia. His official medical reports, however, framed the issue in more mundane orthopedic terms: degenerative changes in the spine, arthritis in the feet, and residual effects from old fractures and surgeries affecting ankle flexibility and proprioception. Examinations described normal neurological findings: no tremor, intact strength, stable reflexes, while attributing his altered walk to wear and tear on joints in the musculoskeletal system, the kind of changes common in active men of his age. Treating physicians recommended orthotics, physical therapy, and continued exercise rather than neurological interventions, and emphasized that brain imaging and cognitive testing were within expected ranges. Still, every televised climb up Air Force One stairs becomes a Rorschach test, with supporters seeing a fit older man and critics seeing decline, illustrating how presidential bodies are read not just by doctors but by partisans projecting their hopes and fears onto each careful step. Number 91. Presidential mercury medicines and the poison in the patent remedies they trusted. In the early republic, presidents swallowed calomel and other mercury-based cures because that was cutting-edge medicine, not quackery. Physicians prescribed these preparations for constipation, fevers, and vague bilious complaints, confident that purging meant healing, while the metal quietly accumulated in nerves and organs. Andrew Jackson's chronic stomach issues, James Polk's frailty, and countless unnamed ailments were treated with doses that today would trigger a toxicology consult. Symptoms like trembling hands, mood swings, mouth ulcers, and digestive misery could be chalked up to the underlying disease, not the remedy in the bottle. The same medical culture that bled patients and blistered their skin also believed a little controlled poisoning might reset the system. Presidents, eager to function and trusting their doctors, kept taking the pills and powders that may have worsened the very weakness they were trying to escape. Number 92. Presidential bloodletting practices in the cure that emptied arteries instead of healing. For the first generations of presidents, bloodletting wasn't fringe. It was standard operating procedure, backed by textbooks and tradition. When George Washington developed a sore throat that rapidly worsened into respiratory distress in 1799, his physicians removed an estimated 40% of his blood within hours, believing they were balancing humors and relieving congestion. Similar logic-shaped treatments for James Madison's fevers, James Monroe's infections, and countless lesser episodes where lancets came out as soon as symptoms appeared. Weakness, dizziness, and fainting spells after treatment were interpreted as signs the illness had been drawn off, not that the patient was now dangerously depleted. In an era before germ theory or IV fluids, the line between therapeutic bleeding and lethal exsanguination was thin, and powerful patients were not exempt. The practice persisted into the 19th century, slowly retreating only as statistics and new science made it harder to ignore that many patients seemed worse after their veins were opened. Number 93. White House secrecy and medical bulletins and the art of saying almost nothing reassuringly. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, presidential health moved from private letters to public bulletins, but secrecy never disappeared. It just became more polished. Grover Cleveland's cancer surgery on a yacht was described to the press as a minor dental issue, complete with carefully worded statements that technically weren't lies while omitting the part about removing a tumor from his palate. Woodrow Wilson's stroke was softened into nervous exhaustion and overwork, while his doctors issued optimistic updates that avoided concrete neurological details. Franklin Roosevelt's heart disease and dangerously high blood pressure were framed as fatigue and sinus trouble, with numbers scrubbed from communiques. Each bulletin had to juggle three pressures at once: the patient's right to privacy, the political need to project stability, and the public's legitimate interest in knowing whether their leader could function. The result was a tradition of medical prose that excelled at sounding calm while leaving crucial facts between the lines. Number 94. The 25th Amendment and illness transparency and the rules written after chaos. For most of American history, there were no clear instructions for what to do if a president was alive but incapacitated, only improvised workarounds. James Garfield lingered for months after being shot, effectively unable to govern while aides shielded him from bad news. Woodrow Wilson's stroke produced a semi-secret regency managed by his wife and a few insiders. Dwight Eisenhower's heart attack and intestinal surgery forced ad hoc letters about how Vice President Nixon would step in if necessary, but nothing was legally binding. The 25th Amendment, ratified in 1967, finally formalized procedures for temporary and permanent transfer of power, turning vague norms into specific steps. Since then, when presidents undergo colonoscopies or other procedures requiring anesthesia, they can briefly hand authority to the vice president and take it back with a signed declaration. That legal clarity has nudged modern administrations toward at least minimal disclosure because invoking, or pointedly not invoking, the amendment itself signals how serious they claim an illness to be. Number 95. The president's physician as political figure and the doctor caught between chart and camera. The White House physician is technically just a doctor, but in practice, the job sits at a three-way intersection of medicine, politics, and public relations. From FDR's cardiologist carefully editing what to put in written reports, to JFK's team juggling painkillers, hormone therapy, and antibiotics while issuing upbeat assessments, presidential doctors have long had to decide how much truth to share and with whom. Some, like Lyndon Johnson's physicians, leaned toward bluntness in private and euphemism in public, while others cultivated reputations as loyal protectors who would never embarrass their patient. Modern press conferences about annual physicals, with rehearsed talking points and limited Q&A, reflect that dual role: reassure the markets and the voters while guarding confidential details. When a doctor's credibility comes under fire, as with disputes over Ronald Reagan's later life recollections or Donald Trump's unusually glowing letters, it isn't just a medical issue, It's a question of whether the interpreter of the president's body can still be trusted. Number 96. Assassination wounds versus medical care and the era-bound limits on presidential survival. When presidents have been shot, the bullet is only half the story. The state of contemporary medicine often determines whether they live. Abraham Lincoln was carried to a boarding house bed and left with a bullet in his skull, treated with techniques that predated antisepsis, neurosurgery, and modern imaging. Survival was virtually impossible in 1865. James Garfield, wounded in 1881, may have had a non-fatal spinal injury, but his doctors repeatedly probed the wound with unsterilized fingers and instruments, introducing infections that modern historians believe helped kill him. William McKinley's abdominal surgery missed internal bleeding that today's trauma teams might detect and manage with better lighting, anesthesia, and transfusions. By the time Ronald Reagan was shot in 1981, quick Secret Service response, emergency thoracic surgery, antibiotics, and intensive care turned what could have been a fatal chest wound into a near miss. The same violence inflicted in different centuries produced very different outcomes, not because bullets became kinder, but because medicine finally caught up. Number 97. Disability and public image in the presidency and why canes, braces, and wheelchairs stayed off camera. For most of American history, visible disability was treated as a character flaw, a sign that someone was weak or unfit to lead. Franklin Roosevelt choreographed every public appearance to hide his paralysis, locking leg braces, strong arms, and carefully staged photographs into an illusion of sturdy health. Earlier presidents with chronic pain, deafness, partial paralysis, or lingering war wounds simply kept them out of official narratives. A limp became fatigue, a tremor nerves, a hearing horn just off frame. The unwritten rule was simple: the nation could tolerate an ailing body, but only if it never fully saw it. Number 98. Mental health before modern language and the moods no one had words to diagnose. Long before psychiatry offered names like depression, bipolar disorder, or anxiety disorders, presidents cycled through emotional storms in plain sight. Abraham Lincoln's melancholy, John Adams's bursts of temper, Andrew Jackson's rages, or Chester Arthur's listless stretches were chalked up to temperament, bile, or the weight of office. Periods that now resemble major depression or hypomania were framed as moral strength tested by despair, or as dangerous passion that needed restraint. Without diagnostic labels or structured treatment, coping meant work, prayer, alcohol, isolation, or overwork, leaving future historians to read symptoms backward through letters and diaries that never use clinical terms. Number 99. Travel, infections, and presidential risk and how shaking hands meant sharing germs. Before air filtration, antibiotics, and bottled water, presidential travel tours were extended invitations to infectious disease. Campaign trains and whistle-stop speeches ran through towns with smallpox, typhoid, influenza, and tuberculosis, while presidents stayed in hotels with questionable plumbing and ate food prepared under unknown conditions. William Henry Harrison's long inaugural exposure, James Polk's grueling journeys, and later rail tours by Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson all mixed exhaustion with crowded receptions and sick admirers pressing close. Every handshaking line and factory visit multiplied microbial roulette, in an era when catching cold was a vague hazard rather than a mapped chain of transmission. Number 100. How presidential illness changed public expectations and the slow march toward demanding the truth. Each major health scare nudged Americans to insist a little more loudly on knowing whether their leader could still function. Garfield's drawn-out decline, Wilson's hidden stroke, and FDR's concealed heart disease all generated after-the-fact anger, the sense that the public had been managed rather than informed. Eisenhower's heart attack, Kennedy's Addison's disease, and Reagan's surgeries further normalized medical briefings, however curated. By the late 20th century, annual physical summaries, televised hospital walks, and formal letters on capacity became expected rituals. Voters still tolerate spin, but less and less accept complete silence about the body that carries the nuclear codes.